Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. A pale mist lay over the shoreline before dawn, curling gently around the wooden pilings of a half-forgotten pier. It was the kind of fog that muffled sound, softening the creak of boards underfoot and swallowing the low lap of water against the posts. Henry Callow had arrived before sunrise, his lantern casting a muted circle of light across the wet planks, drawn by a note left anonymously at the small harbor cafe the day before. It was folded carefully, dampened slightly by the evening rain, with only a single line written in precise, looping script. "Look where the tide forgets." The pier was almost abandoned. A few gulls hovered silently in the mist, and the distant glow of lights from the town across the cove shone like small, distant fires. Henry stepped carefully, noticing the water pooling between the boards and the faint, briny smell of seaweed clinging to his boots. There was no one else, yet the note had a weight to it, as if meant for him specifically. Beneath the fog, the surface of the water shimmered in muted reflections. Something about the angle of the pier seemed unusual, not quite aligned with the small channel, and Henry's mind traced back to an old map he'd seen months ago in the local archives. On that map, a narrow inlet had once curved behind the pier, now partially filled in, almost invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the older charts. Henry paused, his lantern catching on a faint ripple near the posts. He bent slightly, noticing a small object lodged between the timbers. It was a glass vial, narrow, clouded with age, and inside, something faintly pink and opaque, like dried rose water. He set it carefully in his coat pocket, moving slowly, letting the damp air settle around him. He did not rush. The town behind him, Southmarsh, was quiet. Houses huddled along the harbor, their windows still dark, smoke drifting lazily from a chimney or two. Henry's path back to the shore took him past an abandoned boatyard, the hulls of old fishing vessels leaning gently to one side, some with planks missing, others streaked with green algae. He noticed patterns in the peeling paint, shapes that seemed deliberate, an X here, a stripe there, but uncertain if these marks were merely remnants of weather or something more intentional. In the cafe, he returned to the counter, placing the vial gently among the small collection of maritime trinkets and shells. Martha, the owner, moved quietly behind the counter, polishing a row of teacups. "Found something?" she asked without surprise, her voice low and deliberate, as if she had expected this day all along. Henry nodded slowly. "At the pier, near the posts." She didn't ask why, only poured a small cup of black coffee and slid it across to him. He sipped carefully, listening to the muted hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the floor beneath their feet. Outside, the mist was thinning, but the morning remained cool, and distant foghorns echoed faintly across the cove. Later, Henry walked through the forested edge of town, following a trail that hugged the waterline, the ground soft with early dew. Moss draped from the trees like veils, and the faint scent of pine and brine lingered in the air. He noticed small stacks of stones along the path, each balanced with care, and faint scratches in the bark of older pines, markings that did not resemble animal activity. At one clearing, he discovered a weathered wooden bench tucked under a low-hanging oak. On the bench sat a journal, its leather cover cracked and softened by years of moisture. He picked it up, brushing off layers of dew. The pages were filled with small, neat handwriting, sketches of boats, tides, and something more personal, names, dates, and lists of supplies, as if chronicling tasks that had taken years to complete. Henry carried the journal slowly, taking care not to jostle it. The path led him past a shallow creek, the water rippling gently over smooth stones, and then up a slight incline, where an old lighthouse overlooked the bay. The structure was long abandoned, its white paint faded to gray, and the glass of the lantern room smudged with salt and dust. From the outside, it seemed empty, yet the faintest hint of movement caught his eye, a shadow, barely distinguishable, shifting behind a streaked pane. Inside the lighthouse, the air was cool and carried the tang of rust and old wood. Henry's footsteps echoed faintly on the spiral staircase. He paused on each step, listening for other sounds, but only the slow drip of water from a leak in the ceiling answered him. He reached the top and peered through the glass, tracing the curve of the coastline in the distance. A small boathouse appeared, partially hidden by fog and low-hanging clouds, and he made a mental note to visit it later. Descending the spiral staircase, he found a small, rusted key taped under the windowsill, its surface mottled and textured with age. No note explained its purpose, only the presence of the key itself. Henry placed it in his pocket, the cold metal grounding him in the quiet of the moment. Over the next days, he moved methodically through the town and its outskirts, visiting the old boathouse, the pier at low tide, the abandoned cottages along the cliffs. He spoke quietly with fishermen, gardeners, and shopkeepers, piecing together fleeting details. Someone had lived on the outskirts decades ago, someone meticulous and private, leaving subtle traces of presence. Carefully stacked stones, jars on windowsills, markings in the sand that faded with the tide. Each discovery felt small but significant. In a shed near the cliffs, he found rows of labeled bottles, each containing water from different parts of the cove, sediments settling at the bottom. In the attic of a shuttered cottage, a row of postcards from distant ports leaned against a beam, yellowed with time, each showing the same coastline in different seasons. Henry returned to the pier again one evening, when the tide was low and the fog had softened the edges of the world. He moved slowly across the boards, noting the way the water receded, revealing shells and driftwood he had never seen before. He paused to watch a small heron take flight across the inlet, its wings brushing the surface of the water. The journal, the key, the bottles, the vials, they all formed a quiet rhythm, a gentle pulse of clues that seemed to exist for no one else but him. Henry did not hurry. Each step was deliberate, each observation noted in the margins of his own notebook, the ink smudged slightly by moisture. At night, he would return to the small inn on the outskirts of town, the one overlooking the forested hills beyond the harbor. From the window, he could see faint lanterns bobbing on distant trails, perhaps hikers, perhaps not. The wind carried faint whispers of the sea. The leaves rustled with subtle messages only the most attentive could catch, and the quiet seemed alive with possibility. He began to notice patterns in the stars as well. From the inn's balcony, constellations reflected faintly in the water, a mirror of the sky above. He traced the alignment with the notes in the journal, with the placement of the stones, with the marks on the trees, sensing a rhythm, a careful orchestration that had gone unnoticed for decades. Days folded into nights, and nights into mornings. Henry moved through South Marsh and its outskirts like a soft shadow, recording, observing, connecting. He discovered old phone books in the library basement with highlighted numbers that no longer existed. He He found faded flyers for town meetings that hinted at gatherings long dissolved. The quiet was pervasive, a slow companion that never rushed him, never pressed for conclusions. On the cliffs overlooking the bay, he traced faint footprints in sand hardened by wind and tide. They led to a small alcove beneath the rocks, hidden from casual view, where he found a collection of shells arranged in a spiral, smooth and worn, as if curated over years. Henry knelt beside them, letting the soft sound of waves wash over him, tracing the pattern with his finger, careful not to disturb the subtle order. Evenings at the pier became ritual. He would watch the fog roll in, listen to the soft slap of water against pilings, and notice the subtle shift of tides and light. Occasionally, he would see a figure at the water's edge, too distant to recognize, disappearing before he could approach. In the small cemetery on the outskirts of town, Henry wandered among moss-covered stones and leaning crosses. He found names familiar from the journal and the old town records, dates that overlapped strangely, lives that seemed to intersect without explanation. He paused, letting the wind carry the faint scent of pine and salt, feeling the quiet settle into him like a gentle tide. On the old railway bridge beyond the cliffs, he discovered fragments of letters wedged between the beams, brittle and yellowed, with partial sentences. "The tide remembers. Only the stones, careful." He read them slowly, letting each fragment linger, each syllable settle. And so Henry's days continued, each one unfolding quietly. The mist returned each morning. The heron flew across the inlet. The fog wrapped the pier and the town in soft gray layers. He moved through South Marsh gently, listening, observing, connecting, the mystery growing not in urgency, but in quiet accumulation of small, deliberate details. No conclusions pressed upon him, only the patient, unfolding rhythm of discovery. Every object, every shadow, every subtle sound added another layer to the quiet puzzle. Henry moved with it, step by careful step, letting the town, the coast, the fog, and the old, whispered traces of a life long past guide him gently through the calm, unfolding mystery. The wind shifted, carrying faint brine and pine, and somewhere in the distance, the faintest hint of a bell chimed, soft and slow, echoing across the quiet harbor. The bell's chime faded into the fog, leaving only the soft hiss of water against the pier. Henry lingered at the edge, his lantern casting a narrow pool of light that flickered across the damp boards. A faint path led from the pier to an overgrown trail, where brambles and low branches bent under the weight of morning dew. He followed it slowly, careful not to disturb the silence that seemed to drape over the forest like a thin, warm blanket. The trail opened to a clearing where the remnants of an old sawmill leaned against each other, beams rotting, wheels half buried in moss. The smell of damp wood and earth was heavy, and a crow perched on the tallest post, watching him with patient, dark eyes. Inside the mill, Henry's boots stirred the dust, uncovering old chains and tools scattered across the floorboards. Nothing moved, yet the arrangement of objects seemed intentional. Axes leaned at slight angles, hammers balanced on low benches. Near the back, a small window revealed a patch of lake beyond the trees. Its surface was smooth as glass, reflecting the gray sky, broken only by the occasional ripple from a falling leaf. Henry noticed a faint row of footprints along the shore, partially submerged by the rising water. They were small, deliberate, like someone had traced them carefully along the edge of the lake. He returned to town slowly, passing the empty main street where a single diner remained open, the neon sign flickering softly in the mist. Inside, a waitress named Lillian moved silently behind the counter, stacking cups and wiping down the worn laminate. "You've been around," she said quietly, not asking a question. "Trying to understand," Henry replied, sipping a warm cup of tea. She nodded, sliding a plate of biscuits across the counter. "Some things are easy to see. Some things aren't meant to be hurried. Keep your eyes open." Afterward, he walked the back roads toward a small cluster of cabins at the edge of the forest. Each cabin was weathered, paint peeled in long vertical strips, and smoke drifted lazily from two of the chimneys. He noticed patterns in the placement of rocks along the pathways, small cairns that seemed too deliberate to be random. At one cabin, he found a small journal wedged behind a loose board in the porch railing, pages filled with sketches of trees, stars, and faint symbols, delicate and careful. The next morning, Henry explored the ranger station near the North Ridge, a wooden structure half hidden among pine trees. Inside, he found maps pinned to corkboards, some marked with dates decades old, others recent, noting minor changes to the trails, the lakes, and the forest edges. A retired ranger, Mr. Whitlow, arrived slowly, leaning on a cane. "You're the one asking questions," Whitlow said. "These woods hold their own stories if you listen." They walked quietly outside, Henry tracing the faint paths where old logging tracks met newer trails. Whitlow pointed out subtle changes in the terrain, tree stumps arranged in patterns, hollows in the earth that collected rainwater in unusual ways. People used to live in these parts. Some left messages for those who would notice, he said softly. At a small, forgotten dock further down the river, Henry found a series of tied-up rowboats, each with a single oar resting across its bow. One boat carried a small bundle of letters wrapped in cloth, water-stained but legible. The handwriting was consistent, neat, and faintly familiar from the journals he had found earlier. He read them slowly, letting the words settle. The letters spoke of tides, of quiet observations, of paths walked repeatedly to mark unseen rhythms. On a misty road winding through the northern forest, he came across an abandoned greenhouse, its glass mostly intact but streaked with moss and condensation. Inside, Henry found pots with soil still soft, remnants of plants carefully labeled with tiny, faded tags. There were seeds scattered along the shelves, arranged in clusters that suggested deliberate planting, patterns only visible when looked at from above. Evenings returned him to the lake, where the water lapped quietly against the reeds. He traced shadows moving beneath the surface, perhaps fish, perhaps not. Occasionally, a small lantern bobbed on the opposite shore, appearing and vanishing without explanation. The reflection shimmered in the calm water, merging sky and lake in muted silver. At the edge of a clearing near the lighthouse cliffs, he discovered a weathered shed, half collapsed. Inside, there were stacks of wood, old tarps, and a small metal box containing photographs. Each photo captured the town from unusual angles: rooftops, the pier, the lake, the cabins, taken over years in different seasons, always empty of people, yet suggesting someone had observed patiently, quietly. In the mornings, Henry began noticing subtle changes in the wind patterns, the way fog rolled down the hills differently, depending on the hour, and the precise alignment of shadows through the pine canopy. He recorded each observation in careful, slow notes, letting the forest guide him. One afternoon, on a gravel road leading to a distant ridge, he met a man named Ellis, trimming trees outside a small lumber workshop. Ellis spoke in low tones, recounting stories of people who had vanished long ago, leaving behind objects, notes, or patterns that no one else noticed. They were patient, Ellis said, like the wind carving shapes into the rocks. Henry listened, feeling the quiet expand around him. The road ahead curved toward a hidden valley, where a small creek twisted between stones smoothed by time. Here, he discovered a circle of moss-covered rocks, each carefully placed, faintly echoing patterns he had seen at the pier, the lake, and the cabins. The repetition was subtle, barely perceptible, yet undeniable. At night, the inn remained a refuge. From the balcony, he could watch the forest darken, the lake disappear under shadows, and distant lights flicker like embers in the mist. The soft rustle of leaves, the faint drip of water from roofs, and the occasional owl's call became the rhythm of his days. A week later, he explored a narrow footbridge over the creek, its boards old and groaning softly. Beneath it, water collected in a small pool, reflecting fragments of sky and forest. A single boot, worn and waterlogged, rested on a submerged stone, untouched by time, yet suggestive of careful placement. He continued along the creek to a remote cabin, half hidden behind thick undergrowth. Its windows were shuttered, but the door yielded to gentle pressure. Inside, the air smelled of damp pine and old smoke. Shelves held jars filled with sand, water, seeds, and tiny pieces of driftwood. Each was labeled in a careful hand, the language cryptic but methodical, suggesting observation and patient record-keeping. At dawn, Henry walked the cliffs again, tracing faint animal tracks and the occasional human footprints in sand softened by the tide. A small lantern lay at the edge, extinguished but carefully placed, as if left to mark a precise point. The forest and the water became a slow map of interconnected observations. Each cabin, dock, pier, greenhouse, and trail contributed a piece, and Henry moved gently between them, recording, noting, observing. The mystery unfolded not in sudden revelations, but in the quiet accumulation of small, deliberate details, the subtle choreography of objects, shadows, water, and stone. The mist rolled in again that evening, curling around the docks and houses like a soft veil. Henry paused, listening to the distant call of gulls and the faint, rhythmic drip of water from the eaves. Somewhere across the lake, a lantern appeared and vanished in the fog. He stepped forward, lantern in hand, moving slowly along the shoreline, tracing the gentle contours of land and water. The rhythm of South Marsh persisted, soft, deliberate, and patient, guiding him further into its quiet secrets. The lantern's light danced across the water as Henry followed the shoreline, moving slowly over smooth stones slick with morning dew. The tide was low, revealing hidden channels between clusters of reeds, each pool reflecting pale gray sky. He knelt beside one, tracing a pattern of small shells pressed gently into the mud, arranged in a circle. The arrangement was subtle, almost imperceptible unless observed closely, and he lingered, letting the calm seep into him. A narrow path led inland from the shore, winding through a grove of tall birch and cedar. The forest floor was soft with moss and fallen needles, and the quiet was broken only by the distant rush of a stream. He followed the sound to a wooden footbridge, its beams weathered and damp. Beneath it, the water ran clear, shallow enough to reveal smooth stones, each etched with faint scratches. He crouched to examine them, noticing patterns that resembled letters or symbols, but no clear meaning emerged. Beyond the bridge, a forgotten road twisted through the trees, lined with abandoned houses and overgrown gardens. One house had a door ajar, revealing a dim interior where dust motes floated like tiny lanterns in the weak sunlight. Inside, shelves were filled with glass jars of dried herbs and small vials of colored liquid, some labeled in a careful hand. A single chair sat by a fireplace, worn and crooked, as if someone had just stepped away. Henry stepped lightly across the threshold, careful not to disturb anything. He found a narrow staircase leading to the attic, where boxes of old letters and ledgers were stacked. Opening one, he discovered detailed records of tides, weather, and forest observations chronicled over many years. He ran his fingers over the paper, feeling the quiet dedication of a life lived in patient attention to small details. Walking back toward town, he passed a small roadside cafe tucked beneath a low hill. The sign above the door swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, a woman named Clara arranged pastries behind the counter. She spoke softly when he entered, her voice barely rising above the hum of the refrigerator. "Some people come here looking for answers," she said, setting a cup of tea before him. "Some leave more questions than they arrived with." Henry nodded, sipping slowly, letting the warmth settle. Outside, the fog rolled in from the hills, softening the edges of the town and making the street lamps glow like small halos. Later, he explored a small lake nestled deeper in the forest. Its surface was still, mirroring the trees perfectly. A rickety dock extended into the water, boards creaking gently under his weight. He noticed small piles of stones at the corners, each topped with a single feather, carefully balanced. Sitting quietly, he traced the patterns in the sand and water, sensing the slow rhythm of someone else's careful observations. A trail from the lake led to a cabin half hidden in the underbrush, its roof covered in moss. The door was locked, but through a narrow window, he could see shelves lined with journals and small objects arranged in meticulous order. The faint smell of wood smoke lingered, though no fire burned. He pressed his hand to the glass, feeling the quiet presence of someone who had lived there with deliberate attention to the world around them. Returning to the main road, Henry came across a ranger station he had not noticed before, set at the base of a low ridge. Inside, maps of the surrounding forests and waterways were pinned in layers, some marked with handwritten notes about trails, rare plants, and wildlife. The current ranger, a man named Talbot, moved slowly through the room, his boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor. "There's more to this place than people realize," Talbot said quietly, pointing to a corner where faint, precise lines were scratched into the wood of the wall. "People notice what they need to notice. Everything else is patient." Henry spent hours tracing trails further into the forest, finding small clearings where stones were stacked in patterns or small figurines left on logs. Occasionally, he heard distant voices, fishermen, hikers, or children playing, but the sounds always faded before he could approach. One afternoon, he followed a narrow road that curved around a series of hills toward a remote dock. A single boat rocked gently in the current, tied with a rope frayed by time. On the dock, a crate had been left open, containing bundles of papers, sketches of clouds, tides, and forest lines, as though someone had tried to capture the rhythms of the world in ink. Further along the road, he discovered a small, abandoned mill house. Its water wheel was still, moss overtaking the wooden paddles. Inside, the floor was covered with faintly colored chalk lines, forming geometric patterns across the boards. Henry knelt to examine them, tracing the subtle shapes with his fingertips, noticing how the patterns aligned with the windows, the doors, and the spaces where sunlight fell during certain hours. He He ventured to a quiet gravel path leading to a cabin perched on a ridge overlooking the lake. Smoke from a distant chimney curled lazily into the sky, and the soft hum of the forest surrounded him. On the porch of the cabin, small objects, stones, shells, twigs, were arranged in deliberate order. Henry moved slowly, recording the arrangements and noting their placement in relation to the lake, the path, and the surrounding trees. At dusk, he walked to a forgotten railway line, the tracks stretching straight through the woods and curving gently over low hills. The rails were rusty, the ties soft with moss. Alongside the tracks, he found small markers carved into wood, each one with initials and dates faintly etched. He traced each one, feeling the slow accumulation of quiet observations left behind by unknown hands. By the time he returned to the inn, the sky had darkened to deep blue, and the first stars were appearing above the forested hills. The windows reflected pinpricks of light from distant cabins and the faint glow of the lake. Henry sat on the balcony, tracing constellations in his notebook, comparing them to sketches and symbols he had discovered throughout the town and forest. He rose before dawn the next day, walking toward a narrow cove beyond the cliffs. The sand was damp, smooth, and scattered with driftwood. He noticed faint footprints along the waterline, too small and precise to be casual. A lone lantern rested atop a boulder, extinguished but carefully positioned to mark the curve of the shoreline. Through the morning mist, he reached a small boathouse hidden in reeds. Inside, wooden crates were stacked, some containing vials, others bundles of small sketches. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and water, and the quiet seemed to hum softly in the corners of the room. He moved slowly, letting each detail settle, observing the careful order, the deliberate absence of haste. From there, a narrow trail led into the hills, where he discovered a series of small cabins arranged in a rough semicircle. Each had shutters closed, and smoke rose faintly from one chimney. Rocks were stacked in patterns along the paths, and the ground bore small markings, almost like trails left intentionally for those who noticed. Henry paused at the edge of the clearing, watching the sun rise behind distant ridges, painting the mist in gentle shades of silver and gray. The lake shimmered quietly below, reflecting the hills and scattered cabins. He breathed deeply, letting the rhythm of the town, the forest, the water, and the carefully placed objects guide him further into the unfolding mystery. Henry traced the edge of the ridge, the mist curling softly around his ankles and dampening the grass beneath his boots. From this height, the town below seemed small, quiet, and suspended in its own rhythm. A narrow trail led into the forest beyond, lined with old wooden posts that leaned slightly, their surfaces weathered by wind and rain. Each post bore faint scratches, almost like tally marks, irregular but deliberate. The trail opened to a clearing dominated by a long-abandoned schoolhouse. Its windows were dark, some cracked, letting in strips of gray light that highlighted the dust drifting through the air. Henry moved carefully over the wooden floorboards, noting the scattered remnants of chalk and faded posters on the walls. On a windowsill, a stack of notebooks lay in gentle disorder, each page filled with neat handwriting chronicling daily observations of weather, wildlife, and the town's tides. Outside, the forest whispered in gentle sighs as wind passed through the pines. He noticed a faint path leading behind the schoolhouse to a small, hidden orchard, trees laden with unripe fruit. At the base of one tree, stones were arranged in a careful spiral, surrounding a shallow depression in the earth. Henry crouched, brushing his hand across the pattern, feeling the care that had gone into such a quiet, patient arrangement. The orchard trail led him to a narrow dirt road, bordered by low wooden fences that creaked softly in the breeze. Along the road, he found a small, almost hidden workshop. Inside, tools hung on the walls in meticulous order, and a thin layer of dust covered piles of unfinished wood carvings, tiny birds, abstract shapes, and delicate boats. A small radio played static softly in the background, adding to the hush of the room. Henry stepped out and followed a stream that curved gently through the nearby woods. The water was shallow and clear, revealing stones smoothed by decades of gentle currents. He noticed a single, folded piece of paper pressed beneath a stone, weighted carefully. Opening it, he found sketches of the lake, the pier, and the nearby cabins, annotated with arrows and notes in tiny, precise handwriting. He returned to town in the early afternoon, passing a row of small businesses along the main street. Most were shuttered, but one, a tiny bookshop, had its door open. The air inside smelled of aged paper and varnish. Behind the counter, a man named Pharaoh dusted shelves silently, arranging books with quiet attention. "You're following something," Pharaoh said without looking up. "This town doesn't let everything go unnoticed. It keeps its stories. You just have to find them." Henry nodded, letting the words sink in. He moved through the aisles slowly, tracing titles of old journals and guides to local flora and fauna. He found a shelf tucked away in the corner with books on tides, coastal winds, and distant lighthouses, each marked with faint lines in pencil. Later, he wandered along a gravel road leading toward a remote ranger cabin deep in the forest. The cabin was small, its roof covered with moss and lichen, smoke curling faintly from a chimney. On the porch, small bundles of dried herbs and leaves were tied carefully, labeled in fading ink. Inside, a map covered the wall, showing paths, streams, and tiny markers along trails. The current ranger, a woman named Myra, spoke softly about the history of the area, her voice almost blending with the creak of the wooden beams. "There were people who paid attention," she said, gesturing to the map. "To the forests, the lakes, the cliffs. They left traces. Some patterns last longer than memory." Henry left the cabin and followed a faint trail toward a secluded lake. The water was glassy, reflecting the gray sky and the surrounding trees. A small wooden dock jutted out into the lake, old and quiet. At the end, a single rowboat floated, tethered loosely with a frayed rope. Inside, a bundle of sketches and notes had been left, the edges damp from overnight mist. He moved toward a ridge overlooking the lake, where he discovered a small, shuttered boathouse tucked between trees. Inside, shelves held bundles of paper, small vials of water from the lake, and containers filled with sand and pebbles, each carefully labeled. A faint trail of footprints led from the boathouse to a nearby path through the forest, winding toward an area where the trees thinned and the air smelled faintly of salt. Following the path, Henry reached a deserted highway town, long abandoned except for the occasional stray animal. The buildings leaned slightly, roofs sagging with age. Inside the old post office, he found stacks of envelopes and letters, organized meticulously by date. Many were addressed to people who had lived decades ago, some containing sketches and observations that mirrored the patterns he had seen at the pier, the cabins, and the lakeshore. A small diner at the edge of town had lights flickering faintly. A woman named Agnes served coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. "They used to mark things," she said quietly, nodding toward the hills. "Little patterns, little notes. just enough for someone paying attention to notice. Henry sipped his coffee slowly, letting the quiet settle around him. Outside, the wind whispered through empty streets, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. He followed a narrow trail beyond the diner into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. He discovered a clearing with a series of small cairns, each topped with a single leaf or feather. At the center, a shallow depression in the soil suggested something had been carefully placed there and removed. Henry knelt, tracing the edges with his fingertips, absorbing the deliberate, patient care of the arrangement. Further along, the trail curved toward an abandoned ranger watchtower, its wooden steps creaking softly under his weight. From the top, he could see the lake, the pier, the small cabins tucked into the forest, and the road winding through the ridge. Each element appeared connected in subtle ways, like pieces of a slow, quiet choreography. Beneath the tower, a small shed held lanterns, jars of water, and delicate carvings of animals and boats. Each item was arranged with precision, and Henry lingered, noting how light and shadow fell across the shelves in patterns that shifted slowly through the day. He walked down to a small creek, following it as it twisted between moss-covered stones and fallen trees. At one bend, he found a single boot carefully placed on a rock, its companion nowhere in sight. Nearby, a faint carving in the bark of a tree suggested initials and a date, barely legible in the soft light. As dusk approached, Henry made his way to a wooden pier that jutted into the far end of the lake, quieter than the main harbor. Mist rolled over the water, softening the edges of the trees and hills. He noticed subtle lines etched in the boards of the pier, patterns aligned with the reflections in the water. Sitting quietly, he let the gentle rhythm of the lake, the forest, and the carefully placed markers guide him through the hush of evening. The wind shifted, carrying faint briny air from the distant cove. Henry rose slowly, moving along a narrow forest path toward a cabin half hidden in low-lying trees. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, and small bundles of herbs were tied carefully on the porch railing. Inside, journals and sketches were stacked neatly, each documenting the subtle shifts of light, tide, and forest growth. He traced the patterns, the careful markings, the quiet, deliberate gestures left across the town, the lakes, and the forests, allowing each observation to settle slowly into his mind. The fog crept in gently, softening the outlines of trees and cabins, and the water reflected pale strands of light from the sky above. From the ridge, Henry watched the town beneath him, quiet, suspended, as the sun sank low. A faint lantern bobbed across the lake, moving slowly, deliberately, a gentle rhythm echoing through the mist. He stepped forward along the trail, following the quiet signs, the patient arrangements, the subtle gestures, letting the forest, the water, and the carefully recorded observations guide him further into the intricate, unfolding mystery. Henry paused at the edge of the trail, letting the quiet of the forest settle around him. The mist hung low over the lake, and the reflection of the ridge above wavered softly in the water. He set down his lantern and traced the patterns of footprints, cairns, and small objects he had seen over the past days, letting the details flow together in his mind. Slowly, a shape of understanding began to emerge, not complete, not exact, but coherent enough to guide his next steps. He walked back to the small cabin in the woods, where the journals and sketches had been carefully stacked. Sitting at the worn wooden table, he spread out the pages, arranging them by date and location. He noticed that each observation, whether a carefully placed stone, a jar of water, a pattern of feathers, or a sketch of the lake, was part of a quiet system, a methodical record of changes in the environment and the town over decades. The placement of objects, the markings on trees, the sketches, they were not random. They were a map of attention, a way to measure time, tides, and the subtle rhythms of the world. As he traced the journals, Henry realized that the person who had left these signs had lived entirely in observation. They had not sought attention or recognition, only a careful chronicle of life around the lake, the forest, and the small town. Each marker, whether a cairn, a lantern, a line etched in wood, was a note in a slow, quiet diary that had unfolded over years. He revisited the old pier at dawn, the mist rolling in thin layers across the water. There, he noticed the same subtle order in the driftwood and stones along the shore. He bent to examine a faint spiral pattern, perfectly aligned with the rising sun. It struck him then that these arrangements had been a way to mark time, to observe patterns that would only be understood by someone patient enough to follow them. Returning to the abandoned schoolhouse, Henry opened the journals he had found there. Some contained sketches of students, teachers, and small daily events, but always paired with notes on weather, tides, or the changing positions of shadows. The connection became clear. Every place, every object, every small detail had been part of a single, coherent effort to record life's quiet rhythms. Henry spoke quietly with Talbot, the ranger. "It seems deliberate," he said, pointing to the maps and carved posts he had traced through the forest. Everything was observed. Everything was marked. Talbot nodded slowly. They wanted the patterns preserved, not for anyone else to find quickly, just for the record, for the memory of things that changed slowly. He returned to the cabins on the ridge, noting the same meticulous order in the herbs, stones, and objects carefully placed along the paths. Slowly, the story unfolded without words. Someone had lived here, paying attention to the town, the forest, the lake, and the tides, recording the subtle shifts and cycles over decades. Each artifact, each journal, each careful placement had been a quiet attempt to make sense of the world's small, constant changes. At the lake, he followed the patterns of footprints and cairns one final time. The rowboat, the small lantern, the bundles of sketches, they all aligned with the paths he had traced, forming a quiet, coherent trail through time and space. He saw that each place he had visited connected to another, like a network of attention, a slow, deliberate record of life observed with patience and care. Henry returned to the inn that evening, sitting by the balcony and looking out across the forest and lake. The mist curled softly over the water, and distant lights glimmered faintly through the fog. He thought of the journals, the sketches, the footprints, the cairns, and the careful patterns that had guided him here. The mystery was no longer a puzzle to solve with sudden revelation. It was a slow, quiet understanding, a realization of a life lived with meticulous attention, a life that had left traces for anyone willing to notice. He made notes in his own journal, reflecting gently on the connections he had seen, the patterns of observation, the deliberate placements, the chronicle of the town and its surroundings. It all spoke of quiet devotion and careful care, of a desire to witness and preserve without intrusion. Each detail now made sense as part of a broader, calm order. Walking the final stretch along the trail toward the ridge, Henry noticed the same subtle alignments in the stones, leaves, and small objects he had seen throughout his journey. The realization settled softly. like the mist curling over the water. The mystery was not one of danger or disappearance, but of careful observation, patience, and the quiet shaping of the world in ways only a truly attentive eye could follow. Sitting by the water, lantern dim beside him, Henry traced the reflections in the lake. The patterns of light, shadow, and placement seemed to breathe together in gentle rhythm. He understood now. The town, the forest, the lake, and the subtle markers were all part of a slow, deliberate narrative of life, observation, and memory. He leaned back on the soft grass, letting the mist and quiet wrap around him. Every footprint, every journal, every stone cairn was a reminder of patience, of noticing, of the beauty in small, deliberate acts. And as the evening settled into night, the lake reflected the first faint stars, soft and steady, mirroring the careful, quiet understanding that had guided him through the mystery. The realization deepened slowly, gently, like the tide against the shore, leaving Henry with a calm, reflective clarity he had never expected when he first arrived at the fogged pier. Case 2. Rain had been falling lightly for hours, a thin, persistent drizzle that left the air soft and damp. On the edge of the coastal village, near the quiet line where the cliffs met the sea, a small fishing boat rested oddly in the sand, tilted slightly to one side, as though it had been nudged by something unseen. Its hull was worn and barnacled, paint peeling in delicate flakes, and there was no sign of its owner nearby. The village itself was unusually quiet that morning. Narrow cobblestone streets shimmered with moisture, and the faint smell of salt and wood smoke hung low. A few shutters were drawn tight against the chill, and the occasional clink of a metal sign in the wind was the only sound. Nobody seemed to notice the boat's presence, or perhaps nobody wanted to. A solitary investigator arrived along the winding road, tires splashing shallow puddles as he slowed near the shoreline. He stepped out, letting the damp mist cling to his coat, and walked toward the boat, eyes scanning the sand for any clues that might explain why it was left here. A faint set of footprints led from the edge of the dunes toward the village, but they were half erased by rain and wind. Nearby, the abandoned pier groaned quietly under the weight of the wind. Boards shifted gently, and the rope lines of moored boats whispered against their posts. At the far end of the pier, a forgotten crate rested, waterlogged and split along one corner, its contents barely visible beneath tattered canvas. A few small glass bottles, covered in layers of sand, clinked together softly when nudged. The investigation took a slow turn inland. Cobblestone alleys gave way to narrow dirt paths between stone cottages. Smoke from chimneys mingled with the fog, creating a soft, hazy veil over the small village. One door, slightly ajar, revealed a quiet room filled with the faint scent of salt and dried herbs. Inside, walls were lined with shelves of papers and jars, some filled with pale powders, others with dark liquids, each labeled in neat, tiny handwriting. In the forest just beyond the village, trees stretched tall and dense, their leaves whispering in the gentle wind. A narrow trail wound through the undergrowth, flanked by moss-covered rocks and fallen branches. The investigator paused at a clearing where sunlight barely penetrated, noticing a circle of small stones arranged with care. Each stone bore a faint carving, nearly imperceptible, as if the forest itself had been cataloging something over time. A slow walk down the cliffside path revealed an old lookout tower, abandoned and leaning slightly with age. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and rust. A notebook lay on a splintered table, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Sparse entries described the tides, patterns in the clouds, and the comings and goings of local boats. But occasionally, in carefully written lines, there were mentions of voices, glimpses of figures in the fog, and objects that seemed to appear where they shouldn't. The coastline stretched on quietly, empty coves and jagged rocks catching stray shafts of light as the rain softened into mist. Along one isolated beach, fragments of pottery and glass were scattered, half buried in sand. Some of the fragments had faint scratches, almost like tiny letters, etched carefully into the surface. They seemed too deliberate to be random. Returning to the village, the investigator paused at the small, shuttered library near the center of town. Dust motes floated through a crack in the window as he lifted the latch. Inside, rows of old newspapers and local records whispered stories of the past. Among them, he found notes about boats that vanished without warning, unclaimed belongings left at docks, and letters that spoke of neighbors hearing strange noises from the cliffs at night, whispers carried by the wind. In the hills above the village, a narrow dirt road wound along ridges lined with low stone walls. Sheep grazed quietly in misty fields, their silhouettes barely visible through the fog. At one bend, an old barn leaned precariously, its roof sagging under the weight of moss. Inside, a collection of fishing nets and wooden crates lay forgotten, but tucked into a corner. A small bundle of papers wrapped in oilskin hinted at careful preservation. Diagrams of boats, rough sketches of the coastline, and cryptic notations were visible if one looked closely enough. Evening fell gently, and the village lights flickered on, warm amber against the encroaching gray of the night. From a distance, the lighthouse cast slow, steady beams across the water, illuminating the ripples and the small waves that lapped against the sand. Shadows stretched long across the wet streets, and in one alley, a tiny pair of footprints, too small to belong to an adult, traced a path toward the dunes, fading gradually into the dark. The investigation meandered farther into the forest, following a faint trail alongside a stream that murmured softly over smooth stones. Small birds called from the branches, distant but clear, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at movement just beyond sight. Along the banks, worn carvings in the bark of ancient trees suggested markers, left over time, perhaps warnings or records of something long forgotten. A deserted lighthouse keeper's cottage stood near the edge of the cliffs, paint flaking and windows dim with age. Inside, faint scratches on the floorboards hinted at furniture moved in careful patterns. A single chair was placed near a window, facing the sea, and beside it, a small notebook contained sketches of the tides, the cliffs, and the small boats that came and went, along with quiet notations about figures seen from afar, always fleeting, always hesitant. The tide rose slowly, pushing the small boat at the edge of the sand just enough to rock it gently. In its hull, faint stains of salt water and driftwood suggested long periods at sea, and a few scattered belongings, clothing, a lantern, and a small, leather-bound journal, hinted at someone who had traveled far yet returned here unexpectedly. The hills around the village became quieter as night deepened, fog rolling in from the sea and settling softly between trees and rocks. A narrow path led to a hidden glade, where stones were stacked in low piles, and a single rusted lantern swung faintly in the wind. Here, the investigator noticed a faint pattern, almost imperceptible at first, a rhythm in the placement of the stones, a careful alignment with the rising moon, perhaps, or the sound of the tide. Inside one small, dimly lit workshop on the edge of town. Glass jars lined the shelves, filled with preserved plants, small bones, and polished stones. A ledger lay open, entries written in a careful hand, describing movements along the coast, items found washed ashore, and sightings of boats drifting alone. Occasionally, entries referenced an unknown figure, always described as distant, quiet, and observant, moving along paths just beyond notice. Through the night, the fog thickened along the cliffside road. The investigator moved slowly, guided by faint lantern light and the whisper of waves far below. A half-buried crate near a rocky outcrop contained fragments of letters, water-stained but legible enough to reveal cryptic references to arrivals, departures, and quiet meetings by the shore. A small, abandoned chapel rested at the end of a winding trail in the forest, its bell tower empty and quiet. Inside, rows of pews were dust-laden, and faint scratches lined the floorboards. On the altar, a collection of small objects, pebbles, shells, and fragments of wood, was arranged deliberately, each item placed with intention. The air smelled faintly of salt and damp stone. Back along the coastline, the lighthouse's beam cut through the mist, illuminating a narrow path to a hidden cove. Driftwood and small crates were scattered along the sand, and delicate footprints, some human, some smaller, crossed the cove in patterns that suggested careful movement over time. Among the debris, a single, closed notebook rested, its cover soft and worn, promising stories that had yet to be revealed. The village itself settled into quiet slumber. Dim lights glimmered behind shuttered windows, the occasional dog barked in the distance, and the wind moved softly through the trees. Somewhere, in the forest, the faint outline of a trail could still be traced, leading toward cliffs, cottages, and hidden clearings, each place holding fragments of a story that unfolded slowly, deliberately, like the ebb and flow of the tide against the rocks. In a small back alley, the investigator paused beside a shuttered workshop. Through the dusty window, faint shapes of objects could be discerned, tools, maps, and notes, all carefully preserved despite the layers of neglect. A faint pattern in the dust suggested repeated visits, small movements, and quiet adjustments, almost imperceptible, but enough to hint at someone paying careful attention over time. Along the stream in the forest, the soft murmur of water continued. Moss-covered stones bore scratches, tiny notches, and subtle markings. Each seemed to record something, a gentle, patient log of movement and presence. The investigator knelt to observe, tracing the pattern with a fingertip, feeling the slow rhythm of the environment and the quiet story that had been unfolding here for years. A faint light appeared on the distant horizon over the water, the early glow of dawn brushing soft pink and gray over the cliffs. The boat on the sand remained tilted, half hidden by fog and shadow, and the small cove, the forest glade, the abandoned pier, and the lighthouse keeper's cottage each held their silent testimonies. Footprints, papers, notes, and fragments continued to whisper quietly, hinting at journeys taken, patterns observed, and mysteries that had grown slowly, patiently, in the soft, persistent rain. And as the day edged forward, the village remained calm, the mist lingering, the tide gently rocking small boats, and the investigator continued to follow the subtle traces, letting the quiet observations guide him deeper into the story, each step measured, deliberate, and unhurried. The mist lingered over the village as the investigator made his way along a narrow, winding road that led away from the cliffs. Low stone walls flanked the path, their surfaces slick with moss and rain. Occasionally, the faint outline of a distant cottage could be seen through the haze, smoke curling gently from a chimney, and the soft sound of a bell from some hidden farmyard carried faintly across the damp air. At the edge of the forest, a small ranger station stood, long abandoned. Its wooden siding was weathered to silver gray, and the windows reflected the soft light without revealing what lay within. A loose sign creaked with the wind, "Keepers of the Trails." It read, faded almost to illegibility. Inside, stacks of maps and ledgers remained in quiet disarray, some papers scattered across the floor, others tucked neatly in drawers, as if the last ranger had left in a hurry, or perhaps had never truly left at all. Following a faint trail from the ranger station, the investigator entered a section of the forest where the trees were taller, older, and closely packed. The ground was soft beneath his feet, covered in damp needles and fallen leaves. Sunlight, weak and diffused through the thick canopy, highlighted small details. A collection of mushrooms arranged along a mossy log, a small carved symbol on the bark of an oak, and a narrow path that seemed to vanish into a hidden grove. At the edge of the grove, a secluded cabin appeared. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, and vines crept along the wooden walls. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke. A small fireplace contained remnants of ashes, gray and cold, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, each containing tiny objects, buttons, thimbles, pebbles, and bits of driftwood. A folded piece of cloth rested on a table, its edges frayed, and atop it, a delicate sketch of the coastline and the village, drawn with meticulous care. The investigation led next to a narrow lake, calm and still, its surface like glass. Mist hovered low over the water, concealing the far shore. Along the bank, reeds swayed quietly, and a small wooden dock extended into the lake, weathered and splintered. On the dock, a few fishing rods leaned against each other, and a tin box sat nearby, rusted and sealed. Inside were carefully rolled pieces of paper, faintly damp but legible, sketches of trees, notes on the patterns of wind and water, and subtle marks that suggested the observer had been tracking something or someone over time. A quiet road ran along the far side of the lake, bordered by low stone walls and hedgerows. Small roadside businesses, closed and shuttered, displayed faded signs advertising produce, local crafts, or repairs. One tiny shop, its doors slightly ajar, revealed shelves lined with jars of honey, hand-carved trinkets, and a ledger filled with brief notes about deliveries, arrivals, and unusual sightings. Mentions of lights on the lake at odd hours, shadows moving along the far shore, and boats that appeared and vanished without warning. In the hills beyond, an old, abandoned schoolhouse stood near a bend in the road. Its windows were boarded, and the bell tower had lost most of its slats. Inside, a faint smell of chalk dust lingered, and the floors creaked under careful steps. Desks were scattered, some upright, others toppled, and on the blackboard, faint chalk marks remained, lines and letters that seemed to form a pattern, or perhaps a message left behind for anyone attentive enough to notice. A small dock on the other side of the lake caught the investigator's attention next. It was narrow, old, and almost hidden by overgrown reeds. A single rowboat was tied loosely to a post, bobbing gently with the movement of the water. Inside the boat lay a coil of rope, a pair of gloves, and a folded map showing paths along the forest, the lake, and the cliffs. Each line on the map seemed deliberate, measured, as if someone had been tracing movements carefully over time. A few locals were encountered along quiet side roads, walking slowly with umbrellas or tending small gardens. Their voices were soft, almost hesitant, as they shared details about missing items, unusual lights on foggy nights, or strange figures glimpsed in the distance. One elderly woman mentioned seeing footprints in patterns that didn't match any person she knew, while a fisherman spoke quietly of a boat drifting alone in the morning mist, its movements precise and silent. The investigation moved farther along a remote section of road, where small cabins dotted the hillside. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, wispy lines. At one cabin, a faded sign reading "Observers Rest" hung crookedly. Inside, piles of notebooks and journals revealed entries cataloging times, locations, and environmental conditions, alongside sketches of boats, figures, and small objects left in deliberate arrangements along trails and shorelines. Through the forest, a faint trail led to a series of stone ruins. Moss and ivy cloaked the old structures, and small saplings grew through cracks in the stone. Within the ruins, delicate arrangements of pebbles, twigs, and shells were scattered across the floors, some forming circles, others patterns that suggested careful thought. Nearby, a small metal box contained scraps of paper, each with brief notes, times, tides, and observations of movement along paths and across the cliffs. A quiet cabin near the water's edge was discovered next, partially hidden by reeds and low trees. Inside, shelves held jars of herbs, small wooden carvings, and neatly stacked bundles of paper. A faded calendar showed entries dating back years, with small symbols marking certain days, perhaps signifying observations, arrivals, or departures. The air smelled faintly of salt, cedar, and rain-soaked earth. A narrow bridge led over a trickling creek farther into the forest, its wooden planks worn and uneven. Beneath the bridge, small fish darted in the clear water, and the bank held faint footprints leading both upstream and down. Along the creek, tiny markers had been set, carved sticks, painted stones, and small piles of leaves arranged deliberately. Each seemed to indicate a path, a pattern, or perhaps a sequence meant to be followed slowly, carefully. Back along the edge of the village, a small cafe, closed for the season, revealed a faint layer of dust on counters and tables. Behind the glass display, jars of preserved fruits and handmade trinkets were arranged neatly. A ledger lay open on the counter, notes in careful handwriting describing deliveries, visitors, and observations of movements along the waterfront and forest trails. The investigator paused at the edge of a hill, looking down over the village. Fog rolled in waves across the rooftops, the lighthouse beam cutting softly through the gray. Footpaths, docks, cabins, and trails formed a subtle web, each leading to small discoveries: jars, sketches, stones, notes, and quiet traces of presence. Each observation felt like a whisper, guiding him gently forward, deeper into the slow rhythm of the village, the forest, and the coast. A narrow path along the cliffs led to an old, shuttered boathouse. Its door creaked softly as it was pushed open. Inside, rows of wooden oars leaned against walls, and tarps covered small boats, each vessel carefully stored. Beneath one tarp lay a small crate, its lid secured with twine. Inside were fragments of letters, sketches of the cliffs, and carefully folded maps, each marking locations along the coastline and the forest with gentle precision. At a bend in a forest trail, a small, forgotten cemetery appeared. Moss-covered gravestones leaned at odd angles, and faint carvings were barely legible. Among the stones, small arrangements of shells and pebbles had been left, delicate and precise. A single bench sat beneath a tree, its paint peeling, inviting quiet observation of the surroundings. Further along a remote dirt road, a small ranger outpost came into view. Its windows were fogged, and faint echoes of past conversations seemed to linger in the still air. Inside, filing cabinets held charts of trails, wildlife observations, and records of boat movements along the coast. One drawer contained a notebook, filled with notes about lights on foggy nights, patterns of movement along the cliffs, and small, careful sketches of objects left on beaches or hidden among rocks. Along a secluded section of lake, an abandoned dock stretched into calm water, reeds brushing its edges. A small rowboat, slightly tipped to one side, contained remnants of rope, a lantern, and faint traces of chalk sketches depicting paths and sequences along the shore and into the forest. Footprints in the mud suggested careful, deliberate movement, repeated over time. A small path through the woods led to a hidden cabin, its roof partially caved in. Inside, faded journals lay scattered, pages yellowed and curling. Notes described patterns of arrival, movement, and observation along the coastline, the forest, and the village, each entry careful, deliberate, and precise. Small sketches of boats, trails, and arrangements of objects suggested someone had been quietly recording details for years, always attentive to the rhythms of the environment. From the cliffs, the lighthouse beam swept slowly across the water, illuminating the edge of the forest, the small cottages, and the narrow, winding roads. In the mist, shadows moved just beyond view, and the investigator continued along the quiet trails, following traces of presence, arrangements of objects, and faint notes left behind, each small discovery deepening the mystery, slowly, deliberately, and without urgency. Fog lay thick over the coastal hills as the investigator traced a narrow, winding trail leading toward a cluster of abandoned cottages. Their roofs were patched with corrugated metal, and the wooden walls groaned softly in the wind. A faint scent of salt and mildew lingered, mingling with the smell of damp earth, and a single window reflected the pale gray of the sky without revealing the interior. Along the trail, a small stream trickled quietly over smooth stones. The water was clear, revealing tiny fish darting beneath the surface. On the banks, thin reeds swayed gently, and the occasional feather, pale and delicate, rested on the moss, hinting at the presence of birds unseen. A flat stone near the water's edge bore faint scratches, arranged almost rhythmically, as if someone had traced a pattern slowly, carefully. At the edge of the cottages, a narrow footpath led into the forest. Trees leaned together, their branches entwined overhead, creating a soft, dappled canopy. Fallen leaves cushioned each step, releasing a faint, earthy scent. Along the path, small stones were stacked in low towers at irregular intervals, some with tiny carvings or scratches. A small feather rested atop one, balanced delicately against the morning mist. The investigator followed the path to a hidden clearing where an old cabin stood, its walls darkened by time. The door, slightly ajar, revealed a simple interior: a small table, a chair, and shelves lined with jars, each filled with natural specimens. On the table lay a folded map of the surrounding forest and coastline, faint pencil marks tracing paths and small symbols that seemed to record movements along the trails, docks, and cliffs. Nearby, A shallow pond reflected the overcast sky, its surface smooth except for the occasional ripple of a fish or the soft fall of a leaf. At the edge, a wooden platform extended a few feet over the water, weathered and gray. A small bundle of papers rested there, dampened slightly by the mist, but legible. Sketches of paths through the forest, notes about lights on the water, and small, careful diagrams of objects placed along the shore were spread across the pages. A quiet road led away from the pond, bordered by low hedgerows and scattered birch trees. Small homes with tidy gardens lined the path, their windows curtained but warm light glowing faintly. An elderly man tended a row of herbs near the road, pausing to speak softly about strange reflections on the lake in the early hours. Boats seemed drifting alone, and footprints along paths that seemed to appear overnight and vanish by dawn. The investigator moved toward a long, narrow pier jutting into the mist-covered lake. The boards were slick with moisture, and ropes tied to old posts swayed slightly with the gentle movement of the water. A single rowboat, tied loosely, contained a coil of frayed rope and a wooden box secured with a clasp. Inside the box were small notes, weathered and faintly damp, documenting times, weather patterns, and subtle observations of movements along the docks, the nearby forest, and the hills beyond. Following the coastline, the trail led to a rocky bluff where an abandoned lookout tower leaned slightly, its timbers creaking softly. Inside, a rickety ladder led to a small platform from which the entire village, the lake, and the surrounding forest could be seen. A notebook lay open, filled with entries describing slow, careful observations. Boats seen at dawn, shadows glimpsed along paths, and small details in the patterns of driftwood along the shore. Through the forest, a narrow, uneven path led to a series of stone steps, worn smooth by time. At the top, a small, secluded cabin appeared, almost hidden among the pines. Smoke from a faint fire lingered in the air, and a wooden table outside held a set of jars, papers, and small objects arranged meticulously. Sketches of the cliffs, coastline, and forest trails were tucked between the jars, each carefully labeled with dates and subtle notations. A quiet, gravel road wound up the hillside toward a ranger station, small and weathered, with windows fogged from condensation. Inside, shelves of maps, notebooks, and equipment lay neatly arranged, despite years of minimal use. A ledger recorded sightings of boats, unusual figures along the trails, and faint lights seen on foggy nights. A small drawer contained a collection of pressed leaves and feathers, cataloged with precision and annotated with symbols matching those found on forest stones and along the lakeshore. The investigator followed a narrow, winding trail leading to a secluded dock, partially hidden by overgrown reeds. A small canoe rested tied to a post, its interior containing a folded map, a pair of gloves, and a lantern, all arranged deliberately. Nearby, faint footprints in the mud suggested careful movement back and forth, some larger, some smaller, all weaving a subtle, deliberate pattern along the shore. Beyond the dock, the trail curved around a low hill, leading to a tiny, abandoned workshop. Its windows were dusted and dim, but inside, tools, jars, and small bundles of paper suggested meticulous care. Notes described subtle movements along trails, patterns of weather and tides, and sketches of boats and figures moving along the coastline. A single chair faced the doorway, worn smooth by repeated use, as though someone had sat quietly for hours observing without being seen. A narrow creek led through the forest, winding past moss-covered stones and low-hanging branches. Along the banks, small markers had been placed, carved sticks, painted stones, and faint piles of leaves. Each seemed deliberate, a way of marking presence or tracking movement in the quiet, hidden corners of the forest. The water whispered softly over rocks, and distant bird calls echoed, blending with the rhythm of the investigation. The investigator traced a faint path to a series of low stone ruins, half hidden among ferns and saplings. Moss and vines covered the crumbling walls, and the floors were scattered with small arrangements of twigs, pebbles, and shells. Nearby, a rusted tin box contained scraps of paper, each carefully inscribed with brief notes, sketches, and diagrams, marking patterns along trails, docks, and forest clearings with precise, quiet intent. At the edge of the village, a small, shuttered shop stood, its display of preserved foods and handmade trinkets dimmed by dust. Inside, a ledger lay open on a counter, notes documenting deliveries, sightings, and subtle occurrences. Lights moving along the lake at night, figures glimpsed in the fog, and objects that appeared in odd, unexpected places. Each entry was careful, measured, and understated, recorded with a soft, patient hand. A winding trail along the forest led to a hidden glade, where an abandoned cabin rested beneath overgrown branches. Inside, faded journals were stacked in neat piles, each filled with observations of the coastline, the village, and the forest. Sketches, maps, and notations described arrivals, departures, and movements along paths, docks, and cliffs, as though someone had been recording everything patiently, slowly, over years. The lighthouse cast its beams softly across the mist, illuminating the edge of the village, the shoreline, and the quiet forest. Footpaths, docks, cabins, and hidden clearings formed a subtle network, each holding delicate traces, sketches, notes, arrangements of objects, and faint footprints. The investigator continued along the winding trails, moving with care, following each small clue, each gentle observation, letting the quiet rhythm of the environment guide him deeper into the unfolding story. A narrow bridge spanned a gentle stream farther into the woods, its wooden planks worn smooth by years of passage. Beneath, water moved slowly over stones, and along the banks, tiny markers, painted pebbles, small stacks of sticks, created a subtle, deliberate pattern. The investigator knelt to observe them, tracing each arrangement carefully, sensing the slow, patient recording of someone's presence over time. Along a hidden path near the cliffs, a small, weathered boathouse appeared. Its door swung softly with the wind. Inside, a few wooden oars leaned against the wall, and beneath a tarp, a crate held maps, folded papers, and sketches of the village, coastline, and forest. Each item was positioned deliberately, as though someone had been meticulously cataloging the surroundings in quiet, patient observation. The fog thickened over the hills and village, drifting through narrow alleys and along quiet roads. Small lights glimmered behind shuttered windows, the occasional dog barked faintly, and the wind whispered through the trees. Footpaths, docks, cabins, and forest trails revealed delicate traces, tiny objects, notes, sketches, and carefully placed stones. The investigator moved slowly, deliberately, following each subtle sign deeper into the mystery, letting the quiet rhythm of the landscape guide him through the soft, mist-laden morning. The mist clung to the hills as the investigator descended a narrow trail toward a small, secluded valley. The ground was soft beneath his boots, moss and fallen leaves cushioning each step. In the distance, a low wooden bridge arched over a slow-moving stream, its timbers darkened with age and damp, the water reflecting the gray light in ripples. Near the bridge, a tiny cabin with a sagging roof and shuttered windows rested beneath a copse of trees. Smoke curled faintly from a thin pipe, but no figure could be seen. A small table outside held jars of seeds, scraps of paper, and a worn notebook filled with careful sketches of trees, stones, and paths through the surrounding forest. The trail continued past a quiet pond, its surface glassy and still, disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a fish breaking the water. On the far bank, a series of small wooden stakes had been planted, each topped with a smooth stone. The stakes formed an irregular line, almost a pattern, and the investigator knelt to observe the faint etchings on the stones, tiny symbols carved delicately, weathered by time. A dirt road led up from the valley toward a ridge where an old, abandoned sawmill stood. Its siding was faded, and broken windows revealed rafters coated in dust and cobwebs. Inside, the air was cool and damp, with faint echoes of machinery long silent. A ledger lay open on a workbench, containing entries of timber shipments, boats arriving, and subtle notes about figures seen along nearby trails, sometimes at dawn, sometimes in foggy evenings. Following the ridge, the investigator found a narrow trail descending toward a hidden lake, partially obscured by reeds and willows. A small dock extended over the water, rotted but still solid. Tied loosely to one post was a canoe, inside which lay a folded map and a small bundle of pencils. The map showed trails through the forest and along the cliffs, marked with tiny symbols and faint lines, connecting points of observation along the shoreline and in hidden clearings. Along a quiet, winding road near the village, a cluster of tiny shops appeared, long shuttered. A small bakery still had a faint smell of flour and yeast lingering in the air, and inside, a ledger noted deliveries of flour, jars of preserves, and occasional reports of unusual lights along the lake or shadows glimpsed moving among the trees. A soft, deliberate scratch of pencil on paper caught the investigator's attention, a note added carefully in the margin. The path led into a dense section of forest, where tall pines blocked much of the light. The ground was littered with needles and small cones, soft underfoot. Alongside the trail, small markers were arranged, piles of pebbles, carved twigs, and moss-covered stones, subtle and precise. The investigator traced the arrangement slowly, sensing a rhythm in the placement that seemed almost like a map or record of movement. A secluded cabin appeared ahead, its roof partially caved in. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and damp cloth. Shelves held jars, dried herbs, and neatly bundled papers. One stack of papers contained sketches of boats, the lake, and the surrounding cliffs, with careful notes about tides, wind, and movements along the trails. A small chair faced a window, worn smooth from repeated use, as if someone had spent long hours watching quietly from inside. Beyond the cabin, a narrow path led to a rocky bluff overlooking the sea. Small piles of stones were arranged along the edge, some with tiny carvings on their surfaces. The wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the faint sound of waves against the rocks below. On a flat stone near the bluff's edge, a notebook rested, pages fluttering lightly in the breeze, filled with diagrams of paths, small observations of boats, and careful sketches of the village and shoreline. A quiet trail ran along the base of the cliffs, weaving through low shrubs and mossy rocks. The investigator noticed faint footprints pressed into the damp soil, small and deliberate, some intersecting with older, larger prints. Alongside the path, broken shells and bits of driftwood were arranged as though marking a sequence, a subtle record of movement across the shore. A narrow road led up from the cliffs to a small, abandoned ranger station. Its windows were fogged, and the boards covering the doors shifted slightly in the wind. Inside, maps and ledgers remained on shelves, faint traces of pencil markings visible along the edges of pages. Notes recorded sightings of boats, lights, and figures along forest trails, each observation measured carefully, with dates and times noted in soft, precise handwriting. The trail continued toward a hidden inlet, where a weathered dock extended into calm water. A small rowboat, tied loosely, contained a coiled rope, a lantern, and a folded sheet of paper covered in faint sketches. Symbols, lines, and subtle diagrams suggested careful observation of paths along the forest, the shoreline, and the cliffs above, each marking a pattern almost imperceptible to the casual eye. Through the forest, a faint path led to a series of low stone ruins, half hidden beneath ferns and saplings. The stones bore small carvings, delicate and subtle, and the floors held arrangements of pebbles, twigs, and moss. Nearby, a rusted metal container held scraps of paper, sketches, and diagrams, each marking trails, docks, and forest clearings in a quiet, deliberate rhythm. At the edge of the village, a small, shuttered workshop sat beside a narrow alley. Inside, dust-laden shelves held jars, tools, and bundles of paper. Notes described arrivals, movements, and quiet occurrences along the lake, trails, and cliffs, with observations recorded meticulously, each entry deliberate and precise. A faint pattern of small marks on the floor suggested repeated presence, subtle and patient, almost invisible in the quiet. A winding trail through the hills led to a secluded cabin beneath tall pines. Smoke curled softly from a thin pipe, and a small table outside held jars, sketches, and bundles of paper. Careful notes described boats drifting along the coastline, figures moving through the forest, and objects placed along trails and shorelines in patterns, recorded over months or perhaps years. Along the edge of a slow-moving creek, tiny markers appeared again, carved sticks, painted stones, and delicate stacks of leaves. The investigator traced them slowly, sensing a rhythm, a subtle record of presence and movement. Small fish darted beneath the clear water, and the occasional bird call echoed through the forest, blending with the soft murmur of the stream. A narrow road along the cliffs revealed an old, shuttered boathouse. Inside, wooden oars leaned against the wall, and beneath a tarp lay a crate filled with folded maps, papers, and sketches. Each item had been arranged carefully, marking paths and observations along the coastline, forest, and village. The investigator traced the subtle arrangements with care, following each faint sign deeper into the soft, mist-laden morning. The lighthouse's beam cut gently through the fog, illuminating hidden trails, cabins, docks, and forest clearings. Footpaths and arrangements of objects formed a quiet network, each marking a presence, a pattern, a careful observation. The investigator moved slowly, deliberately, following the traces and the small clues, letting the rhythm of the environment guide each step into the unfolding story, deeper into the soft, misty landscape. A soft drizzle began to fall as the investigator left the cliffside path, moving along a narrow dirt road that wound between low hills. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the distant sound of water lapping against rocks drifted faintly from the shore. Along the road, a small shed leaned slightly, its roof sagging, and inside, a collection of empty crates and weathered tools suggested long-forgotten use. Past the shed, the trail narrowed and entered a grove of birch trees. The white trunks glimmered softly in the mist, and the ground was carpeted with moss and fallen leaves. Tiny stacks of stones appeared along the path, some arranged in delicate circles, others in straight lines, each marked with faint scratches that hinted at careful attention. A short distance farther, a small cabin sat beside a hidden spring. Its walls were darkened by age, and smoke curled faintly from a narrow chimney. Inside, shelves held glass jars filled with dried herbs, feathers, and small carved wooden figures. On the table lay an assortment of papers, sketches of the forest trails, notations about weather patterns, and subtle marks indicating the movement of boats and figures along the nearby lake. The trail led to a narrow wooden bridge, worn smooth over years of use. Beneath it, a creek meandered quietly over rounded stones, water clear and cold. Along the banks, tiny piles of leaves, twigs, and stones suggested patterns or signals placed deliberately in repetition. A small leather-bound notebook rested atop one of the piles, its pages marked with faint diagrams of the forest paths and the coastline. A quiet road climbed out of the forest toward a ridge overlooking the village. From this height, the rooftops and narrow streets were barely visible through the mist. A lone farmhouse stood nearby, smoke rising from its chimney. The farmer paused at the edge of his field, speaking softly of lights seen in the distance on foggy nights, and of footprints along the hills that seemed to appear and vanish without explanation. Following a narrow trail from the farmhouse, the investigator discovered an abandoned ranger cabin tucked among pines. Its door was slightly open, boards rattling gently with the wind. Inside, maps were pinned to the walls, each annotated with faint lines marking trails, docks, and small clearings. A small box contained scraps of paper, feathers, and stones, all catalogued carefully, as if recording quiet observations over time. A hidden cove appeared beyond the trees, water calm and glassy. A dilapidated dock stretched into the shallow bay, and a single rowboat was tied loosely to a post. Inside the boat, a bundle of papers and a small lantern rested, faintly damp from the drizzle. Maps and sketches detailed the paths of boats, trails through the forest, and subtle markings of objects left along the shoreline. Through the hills, a narrow trail led to a low stone ruin. Moss and ivy coated the crumbling walls, and scattered across the floor were arrangements of small pebbles, twigs, and shells. A rusted tin box contained notes and sketches, carefully detailing movements along trails, docks, and forest clearings, each entry deliberate and precise. The investigator followed a path to a secluded section of lake, hidden by willows and reeds. A small, abandoned boathouse leaned over the water, boards warped and gray. Inside, oars rested against the walls, and a crate beneath a tarp held folded maps, sketches, and notes marking the forest, coastline, and village with gentle precision. Along a narrow creek in the forest, the water whispered over smooth stones. Small markers appeared along the banks, carved sticks, painted pebbles, and subtle arrangements of leaves. Each was placed deliberately, forming sequences that seemed almost like messages or records of quiet movements through the forest. A winding trail led to a forgotten workshop near the cliffs. The windows were dim with dust, and inside, tools and jars sat alongside stacks of folded papers. Sketches and maps documented trails, boats, and figures moving along the coastline, each recorded with patience and care. The floor showed faint patterns of repeated presence, small disturbances suggesting deliberate attention over time. The lighthouse beam swept slowly across the misty coast, illuminating hidden paths, cabins, docks, and forest clearings. Footpaths and arrangements of objects formed a quiet network, marking presence and movement with subtle precision. The investigator moved deliberately through the soft gray morning, following the traces and small signs, letting the rhythm of the landscape guide each step deeper into the unfolding mystery. A narrow wooden bridge led across a quiet stream farther into the forest. The planks were worn and slick with moisture. Along the banks, stacks of small stones and carved sticks formed patterns, subtle but deliberate. The investigator paused to trace the arrangements, sensing an unspoken rhythm, a gentle record of presence over time. At the edge of a small valley, a secluded cabin appeared, nearly hidden by overgrown trees. Smoke curled from a thin chimney, and outside, jars, sketches, and bundles of paper were arranged with careful attention. Notations described boats drifting along the coast, figures moving quietly through the forest, and objects placed along trails and shoreline in patterns, documented over months or years. A winding trail led to a low cliff overlooking a hidden inlet. Small stone piles were arranged along the edge, some carved with faint symbols. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the distant sound of water on rocks. A notebook rested on a flat stone, pages fluttering gently in the breeze, filled with diagrams, small observations of boats, and careful sketches of the village, forest, and shoreline. The path followed the base of the cliffs, weaving among mossy rocks and low shrubs. Faint footprints pressed into the damp soil, small and deliberate, intersecting with older, larger prints. Broken shells and pieces of driftwood were arranged in subtle sequences, marking movement along the shore with quiet intent. The narrow road led to an old, shuttered ranger station atop a hill. Inside, maps and ledgers recorded boats, lights, and figures moving along trails through forest and village. Small drawers contained pressed leaves, feathers, and faint notes, catalogued carefully. Every detail suggested patient observation, quiet and deliberate. A hidden inlet revealed a weathered dock, reeds brushing its edges. A rowboat bobbed gently in the calm water, holding coiled rope, a lantern, and a folded sheet covered in faint diagrams. Subtle markings tracked paths along the forest, shore, and cliffs, each line a patient record of movement and presence. Through dense woods, a path led to a series of low stone ruins. Moss and saplings coated the crumbling walls. Pebbles, twigs, and small shells formed delicate arrangements. Nearby, a rusted container held notes and sketches, mapping trails, docks, and forest clearings in careful, gentle sequences. At the edge of the village, a shuttered workshop hid along a narrow alley. Dust-laden shelves held jars, tools, and bundles of papers. Notes recorded arrivals, quiet movements, and subtle occurrences along lake, forest, and cliffs, each entry precise and measured. Small marks on the floor suggested repeated, patient presence. The forest trail rose into the hills, leading to a secluded cabin beneath tall pines. Smoke curled faintly from a thin chimney. Outside, Jars, sketches, and paper bundles held careful notes on boats, forest figures, and objects placed along trails and patterns, observed patiently over months. Along a gentle creek, carved sticks, painted pebbles, and leaf piles formed a quiet, deliberate rhythm. The investigator traced each one slowly, sensing a hidden sequence, a record of movements through the misty forest. A narrow road along the cliffs revealed a shuttered boathouse. Inside, oars leaned against the walls, and beneath a tarp, a crate held maps, papers, and sketches arranged carefully. The paths and observations recorded within guided the investigator gently deeper into the soft, fog-laden landscape. The lighthouse's beams swept across the mist, illuminating hidden cabins, trails, and docks. Footpaths, objects, and faint marks formed a quiet network, marking presence, rhythm, and observation. The investigator moved slowly, following each subtle sign, letting the gentle cadence of the coast, forest, and village guide him forward. The fog hung low over the village as the investigator turned down a narrow gravel lane, lined with low stone walls that disappeared into the mist. Small wildflowers pushed through cracks in the path, their pale colors muted by the damp light. A faint creak came from an old windmill perched at the edge of a field, its blades moving slowly with the breeze, echoing softly in the quiet. At the end of the lane, a small boathouse leaned precariously over the water, its wooden siding gray and worn. Inside, the floorboards were dusted with sand, and a few empty barrels and crates were stacked in a corner. On a low shelf, a bundle of papers tied with twine contained sketches of the cliffs and shoreline, annotated with faint, deliberate marks noting the positions of boats and small, fleeting figures along the beach. From the boathouse, a narrow trail led into a grove of alder and pine. The air was cool and damp, scented faintly of earth and bark. Along the path, tiny stone cairns had been placed, some topped with small feathers, others with pieces of glass smoothed by time. Each seemed arranged with careful attention, a subtle guide through the soft shadowed forest. A small, abandoned cabin appeared just beyond the grove. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, and vines crawled along the walls. Inside, shelves held jars of dried leaves and herbs, a stack of notebooks, and scattered bundles of paper. The notebooks contained faint sketches of boats drifting along the lake, diagrams of trails, and notes on quiet observations made in the forest and along the cliffs, recorded slowly over time. A winding dirt road led from the cabin toward the ridge overlooking the lake. Along the road, wooden fence posts leaned at odd angles, moss creeping along their surfaces. On one post, a tiny carved symbol could be seen, delicate and precise, the edges softened by rain. The investigator paused, tracing it lightly with a fingertip, sensing the careful attention that had placed it here. Near the ridge, an old ranger station appeared, weathered and nearly hidden among pines. Its windows reflected the gray light, and the door was slightly ajar. Inside, rows of maps and charts lined the walls, each annotated with faint notes about movement along trails, forest clearings, and shoreline docks. A small box held feathers, pressed leaves, and folded scraps of paper, cataloged carefully with dates and times. The investigator followed a narrow path down the hillside to a secluded cove, water still and glassy, its edges lined with reeds. A simple dock extended into the inlet, rotted in places but holding steady. A single rowboat was tied loosely to a post. Inside, a small lantern and a folded map rested atop a pile of papers. The map marked forest paths, hidden clearings, and subtle sequences along the shoreline, each line drawn with careful deliberation. A quiet forest trail led from the cove toward a cluster of stone ruins. Moss and saplings covered the crumbling walls, and across the floor, arrangements of small pebbles, sticks, and shells were placed in deliberate patterns. Nearby, a rusted tin box contained notes and sketches, marking movements along the trails, docks, and forest clearings, recorded patiently over time. Along a narrow creek, the water moved gently over smooth stones, carrying the faint reflection of the gray sky. Small markers lined the banks, carved twigs, painted stones, and carefully stacked leaves. The investigator traced the arrangement slowly, recognizing the rhythm, the quiet record of presence and movement through this secluded forest. At the edge of a quiet hillside, a shuttered workshop rested along a winding path. Dust covered the shelves, but jars, tools, and bundles of paper remained. Notes described arrivals, small movements, and faint observations of lights along the lake and shadows moving among the trees. Marks on the floor suggested repeated, careful presence, subtle and patient. Beyond the workshop, the trail led to a low cliff overlooking the sea. Small piles of stones and faint carvings marked the ground. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the distant sound of waves against the rocks below. A notebook rested on a flat stone, its pages fluttering lightly, filled with diagrams, sketches of boats, and notations on movements through forest, village, and shoreline. A winding path along the cliffs revealed a tiny, abandoned cabin tucked among low trees. Smoke curled faintly from a chimney, and outside, jars, papers, and sketches were arranged with careful attention. Notes described movements of boats, figures in the forest, and subtle arrangements of objects along trails, all recorded with patience over months or years. The investigator followed a gentle creek farther into the woods, its water murmuring softly over rounded stones. Tiny markers lined the banks, carved sticks, painted pebbles, and leaf piles, forming quiet, deliberate sequences. Each arrangement suggested a slow rhythm, a pattern of presence through the soft, mist-laden forest. A small, shuttered boathouse appeared at the edge of the inlet, boards warped by rain and wind. Inside, oars leaned against the walls, and beneath a tarp, a crate held maps, folded papers, and sketches of trails, docks, and shoreline, each carefully arranged. The investigator traced the subtle placements, following their guidance gently, step by step. The lighthouse beams swept slowly over the mist, illuminating cabins, hidden docks, and forest trails. Footpaths, subtle objects, and faint marks formed a network of quiet observation. The investigator moved deliberately, following the rhythm of the land, letting the soft cadence of forest, lake, and cliffs guide him deeper into the unfolding, patient story. A narrow wooden bridge led over a gently flowing stream farther into the forest. Planks were slick with rain, and moss crept along the edges. Small stone stacks and carved sticks lined the banks, arranged with care. The investigator traced each one slowly, sensing the hidden patterns, a quiet record of movement and presence through this secluded place. A secluded cabin appeared at the edge of a low valley, nearly hidden among tall pines. Smoke rose faintly from a thin chimney, curling slowly into the mist. Outside, jars, sketches, and paper bundles recorded observations of boats along the coast, figures moving quietly through the forest, and objects placed along trails and shoreline in subtle, deliberate patterns. Along a winding creek, arrangements of carved sticks, painted stones, and small leaf piles formed a soft, deliberate rhythm. The investigator traced them gently, noting a careful, patient pattern recorded over time. The water whispered softly over rocks, and distant bird calls echoed through the misty forest. A quiet road ran along the cliffs, leading to a small, shuttered boathouse. Inside, wooden oars leaned against the walls, and a crate beneath a tarp contained folded maps, sketches, and papers, each arranged with precision. The investigator followed the subtle clues, moving carefully, guided by the rhythm of the coast, the forest, and the village. The lighthouse beam cut through the fog, illuminating trails, cabins, docks, and hidden clearings. Footpaths and faint marks created a quiet network, recording presence and observation. The investigator moved slowly, deliberately, letting the soft cadence of mist, water, and forest guide each step deeper into the unfolding mystery. The fog began to lift slightly as the investigator paused on the cliffside, tracing the path with careful attention. Each arrangement of stones, each stack of sticks, and every small mark on the trails began to feel less random and more deliberate. Slowly, a pattern emerged, not a map to a single place, but a record, a quiet observation of life along the coast, the forest, and the village. He returned to the notebooks from the small cabin by the pond, spreading the pages on a flat rock. The sketches of boats, trails, and docks now made sense in sequence. Each mark corresponded to a careful tracking of movement. Who had walked along which path, when the tide shifted, how light changed across the cliffs, and how the forest itself seemed to respond to those quiet rhythms. A thought settled into his mind like a soft wave. Someone had been observing, not intruding, not taking, but quietly watching. Each arrangement of stones, each carefully placed object, each note in the journals recorded the subtle dance of life in the village and along the shoreline. It was less a mystery of disappearance and more a chronicle of attentive presence. The investigator visited the hidden inlet again, kneeling beside the rowboat. Inside, the folded map now connected to the sequences of stones along the creek and the piles of twigs in the forest. The maps were not directions. They were records, annotations of patterns, careful observations over months or years. The small bundles of papers with sketches of trees and cliffs no longer seemed cryptic. They were reflections, a quiet attentiveness to time and place. In the forest, the piles of stones and carved sticks fell into a gentle rhythm in his understanding. Each marker corresponded to a day, a movement, or a small observation of something ordinary: footprints of deer, shifts in the water, the rise of fog over the lake. The investigator realized the purpose had never been dramatic or alarming. It had been patient, reflective, and meticulous. He returned to the village and spoke quietly with one of the older residents, a woman who had lived there for decades. She described seeing someone along the trails at dawn, always alone, always careful, never interfering, simply noting the slow passage of the tides, the light through the trees, and the movement of boats across the lake. She had assumed the person was a hermit, but now, in the context of all the clues, it became clear it was a quiet record, a meditation on the rhythms of the place. The notebooks from the ranger station also fit into the picture. They documented not sudden events, but slow observation, the wind shifting through the trees, boats drifting in the mist, figures moving along hidden paths. The entries were almost a diary of the environment itself, an attempt to capture the subtle, imperceptible motion of life along the coast and in the forest. Returning to the small cove, the investigator traced each mark along the shoreline, each sequence of pebbles and twigs. The puzzle of the objects arranged carefully in circles, lines, and stacks finally resolved into understanding. They were records of presence, silent messages noting what was seen and felt. Each arrangement reflected patience and attentiveness, the slow rhythm of someone attuned to the world around them. He walked through the forest, following the patterns, letting the quiet wind and filtered light guide his steps. The piles of leaves, the painted stones, the carved sticks, they all became evidence of the same intention. Not secrecy, not malice, but observation. An unseen chronicler, quietly and respectfully marking the passage of days, the subtle shifts in nature, and the quiet life of the village and the lake. At the abandoned cabin atop the ridge, he found the final piece. A journal, neat and organized, described everything in gentle, careful language. No names were needed. No drama intruded. The writer had recorded movement, light, weather, and tides, noting each observation with reflection and patience. In these pages, the investigator finally understood. The mystery was not of disappearance or crime, but of mindfulness, a quiet act of observing and preserving the slow, unnoticed rhythms of a place. He returned to the cliffs at sunset, the village below glowing faintly through the mist. The arrangements along the paths, the stones, the sketches, the journals, all of it connected. The slow, meticulous attentiveness of one person had quietly recorded the life of the coast, the lake, and the forest. It was a story told without words, without urgency, and now, with gentle understanding, the investigator felt the stillness settle around him. The realization came softly, like the ebbing tide. The mystery had been patience itself. Every clue, every subtle mark, every quiet observation had been a meditation, a way to see and honor the slow, careful passage of life. And as the lighthouse beams swept across the water one final time for the evening, the investigator walked the shoreline with calm clarity, each step in harmony with the rhythm that had been patiently recorded for so long. Case 3. Rain had begun to fall just as the lighthouse's beams swept across the rocky shore, slicing through the mist with a quiet insistence. In the shallow tidal pools beneath the cliff, a small cluster of objects shimmered in the faint light, unfamiliar, almost deliberate in their placement. They were neither driftwood nor shells, yet their presence felt deliberate, almost like a message left in slow motion for someone who might one day wander this lonely coast. The village beyond the cliff had grown silent with the evening fog, windows aglow with muted light that did not reach the narrow streets. Footsteps echoed softly on the wet cobblestones as a local constable made his way toward the edge of town, drawn by a report of strange lights along the water. Each house seemed to lean closer to the street, their shutters half closed, their eaves dripping with water, as if they were keeping their own secrets. By the time the constable reached the lighthouse, the objects in the tidal pools were clearer, small, intricate carvings, each worn smooth by the sea, but arranged in a pattern that suggested intention. He crouched to examine them, noting the faint trace of what might have been paint or ink long ago, almost invisible beneath layers of sand and water. There was no immediate explanation, no note, no clue beyond their quiet, patient arrangement. Later, he visited the small harbor where fishing boats rested against the docks, their hulls creaking softly in the gentle swell. A fisherman leaned against the railing, smoking a thin pipe, watching the rain blur the horizon. He mentioned a man who sometimes came at night, always quiet, always carrying a small bundle wrapped in canvas, but no one knew where he had gone now. The constable noted the emptiness of the harbor, the way the water lapped against weathered timbers with a soft, persistent rhythm, as if the world itself was breathing slowly. The following morning, the fog lingered over the village like a curtain, softening the shapes of rooftops and hills. The constable returned to the tidal pools, this time finding faint footprints in the mud, leading away from the water toward an old, abandoned boathouse. Its door hung crookedly on rusty hinges, the interior dark and still. Inside, a single lantern flickered, left burning without wind or flame disturbance, as if it had been set there deliberately to guide someone's eye. A few streets away, a small general store opened for the day, and the shopkeeper mentioned odd deliveries he had been receiving for weeks. Small packages with no return address, each containing minor curiosities, an old key, a folded paper, a piece of rope frayed at both ends. He kept them in a drawer behind the counter, afraid to discard them, yet unsure why they were being sent. The constable paused at the counter, noticing that the drawer seemed to hum with the weight of quiet significance, as if each object held a memory he could almost touch. By midday, the rain had ceased, leaving the village wet and reflective. The constable walked along the old forest trail on the edge of town, the path lined with pines that swayed softly in the occasional breeze. Here, the air smelled faintly of salt and moss, and he noticed a series of small, deliberate carvings on tree trunks, symbols that matched the arrangement he had seen in the tidal pools. They were subtle, easily missed, yet their repetition suggested an ongoing pattern, a slow whisper of communication across space and time. That evening, he explored a narrow canyon beyond the forest, where the stream's water ran black under the low light, reflecting the deepening shadows of cliff walls. There, he found remnants of a campsite, a faded blanket, a carefully stacked pile of stones, and footprints leading to a small alcove hidden from the main path. Inside, the alcove's walls bore the same markings as the trees and tidal pools, faint but deliberate, connecting each site through invisible threads of intention. Across the ridge, a solitary cabin stood, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. No one answered when he knocked, yet the door was slightly ajar, revealing a room lined with shelves full of journals, sketches, and maps. Each page was filled with observations, quietly catalogued: tides, weather patterns, movements of people, and the arrangement of objects. The handwriting was small, careful, almost hypnotic in its repetition, as if each line had been written to slow down time itself. As dusk fell, he returned to the lighthouse, tracing the coastline by lantern light. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone and seaweed, and the faint sound of gulls drifted across the waves. He noticed another series of carvings at the base of the cliff, faint scratches that had only become visible with the moisture. The patterns seemed to converge, like the edges of a puzzle, suggesting that each site, each discovery, was part of a larger, unspoken design. Later that night, the village lay under a pale moon, streets slick and deserted. The constable revisited the harbor, noting that the packages at the general store had stopped arriving, but that the objects in the tidal pools remained unchanged. The carvings in the trees glowed faintly in the moonlight, and the alcove in the canyon held the same quiet air of expectation. Each detail, observed slowly, seemed to pulse with a secret rhythm, like the soft breathing of the earth itself. In the early hours, he walked the ridge one final time, the ocean stretching endlessly beneath him, waves murmuring softly against jagged rocks. The horizon was shrouded in mist, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, someone, perhaps, carrying a bundle, following a path only half visible. But the figure vanished before he could focus, leaving only the faint echo of intention, the quiet persistence of a mystery that had no immediate answers. The constable returned to his lodgings as dawn broke, light spilling softly over the village rooftops. The tidal pools shimmered with a new clarity, the forest trail whispered with wind through pine needles, and the alcove in the canyon seemed almost to sigh with recognition of his presence. Every site he had visited connected subtly, delicately, as if the land itself had been keeping a slow, deliberate record. Even as the morning unfolded, the objects, carvings, and traces persisted in their silent, patient rhythm, suggesting a story that would reveal itself only gradually, in small, quiet increments. Each discovery seemed to wait for attention, for careful observation, for the steady mind willing to follow the pattern without rushing. A faint fog rolled back in from the sea as the constable traced another route along the cliffs, noting the way the stones glimmered when wet, how the shapes of tidal pools shifted with the tide, and how the quiet resonance of water against rock created its own gentle, hypnotic cadence. Somewhere nearby, a boat moored silently at the dock, rocking just enough to disturb reflections, but not enough to break the stillness. He paused at the edge of the forest again, noting the faint scent of moss and pine, and the way the light filtered softly through low-hanging branches. The carvings here seemed to form a slow progression, leading him inward along the trail. Every step was measured, deliberate, as though the land itself required quiet attention to reveal its secrets. Through the afternoon, he moved between small cabins, forgotten paths, and the edges of the cliffs, each location offering subtle hints. A rope left coiled near a shed, a lantern extinguished mid-path, a note folded into a book left on a windowsill. Nothing shouted for attention, yet everything felt charged with quiet significance, like echoes of someone who had meticulously orchestrated a slow, deliberate presence. As twilight approached again, he returned to the lighthouse, the rain lightly returning, coating the cliffs in a silvery glaze. The tidal pools reflected the beam in a softened, diffused glow. The carvings on trees, stones, and cabin walls seemed to converge in memory, forming a lattice of intention that extended across the landscape. The constable felt the weight of observation, a slow accumulation of subtle truths, as he traced the shoreline, aware that each piece might fit into a larger design he could not yet fully perceive. At nightfall, the village slumbered under a gentle drizzle, each street a quiet ribbon of reflection. The forest whispered in the wind, the cliffs hummed with the soft pulse of water meeting stone, and the harbor lay empty except for the faint rocking of moored boats. The constable paused by the edge of the water, listening, noting, and tracing each pattern in his mind. Every discovery, no matter how small, seemed to breathe slowly into a narrative that was patient, careful, and quietly insistent, waiting for someone willing to move through it with equal calm. The lighthouse swept its beam one last time across the misty coast, illuminating tidal pools, carvings, and small objects with a steady, deliberate rhythm. Somewhere across the village, a lantern flickered in a window, echoing the pulse of the land itself. The constable stayed a while longer, letting the quiet unfold, aware that each gentle observation was a step deeper into a mystery that had no urgency, no noise, only the soft, enduring persistence of its own secret logic. And in the fog, on the cliffs, among the tidal pools and forested trails, the quiet pattern endured, patient and unhurried, waiting for the next attentive presence to notice its subtle, intricate rhythm. Morning came slowly, the fog lifting in soft, uneven tendrils from the cliffs. The constable walked a narrow lane lined with weathered cottages, their chimneys sending thin threads of smoke into the pale light. A faint smell of wood smoke mixed with damp earth, carrying hints of pine from the nearby forest. At the edge of town, an abandoned schoolhouse stood half-hidden behind overgrown hedges. Windows were mostly intact but coated in grime, and the door sagged slightly on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was cool and still, with dust motes drifting lazily in the shafts of light that pierced the broken blinds. A blackboard still bore faint chalk marks, remnants of lessons long past, and in the corner, a small pile of papers had been left undisturbed. He picked through the stack carefully, noting sketches of the village, the coastline, and nearby woods, each annotated with dates and subtle observations. Some pages had symbols faintly etched into the margins, echoing the carvings he had seen along the cliffs and trails. There was no note, no signature, only the quiet insistence of someone who had recorded the world with meticulous attention. Outside, a narrow road wound through the woods toward a small lake. The surface of the water was smooth, reflecting the soft light of the morning sky. A canoe rested at the shore, partially submerged, with a single paddle leaning against a tree. The constable noticed faint footprints leading from the canoe into the forest, suggesting someone had walked along the edge of the lake, though the path was overgrown and easily missed. A few cabins dotted the forest edge, each silent, their porches sagging and paint peeling. One cabin had a small garden of wildflowers, carefully tended despite the isolation. The constable found a journal left on the porch railing, pages filled with observations of birds, tides, and the slow progression of the seasons. The handwriting was small, deliberate, with sketches that mirrored the patterns he had seen elsewhere. He moved along a quiet dirt road that curved past a ranger station perched on a hillside. The building was simple, with peeling white paint and a tin roof that rattled gently in the wind. A ranger emerged, nodding without speaking, and led him to a filing cabinet in the back room. Inside were maps of the area, notes on unusual weather patterns, and reports of small disturbances, lost items, faint tracks, lights seen in the forest at odd hours. Nothing dramatic, yet together they formed a subtle thread, a trail of quiet anomalies across the region. Later, he explored a dock further along the coast. The boards creaked softly underfoot, and the smell of salt water mixed with the faint tang of algae. Several small boats were tied loosely to the posts, bobbing gently. Beneath one dock, the constable noticed an envelope wedged between the pilings. It contained a folded piece of parchment with delicate sketches of the coastline and forest paths, marked with tiny symbols he had not yet encountered. He wandered along a ridge above a narrow canyon, where the stream below whispered over stones and fallen branches. There, carved into a large boulder, were tiny notches forming a pattern that seemed almost musical in rhythm. Each notch was evenly spaced, deliberate, and suggested a slow counting or mapping process. Nearby, he found a bundle of sticks tied with twine, placed as if to mark a point of significance along the trail. Further into the forest, he came across a small, forgotten cabin. The roof sagged, and moss covered its walls, yet inside, the air was surprisingly dry. A lantern rested on a wooden table beside a stack of books and folded papers. Some contained botanical notes, others diagrams of tides and coastal erosion. Each page had subtle annotations that mirrored the symbols he had been tracking: dots, lines, and curves arranged carefully, almost like a quiet code meant to be read slowly. A quiet road led him toward a lake hidden behind a ridge. The water was still, bordered by reeds that bent gently in the wind. On the far side, a small boathouse leaned precariously over the water, its doors slightly open. Inside, a few wooden crates held objects wrapped in cloth: shells, stones, and small carved figures. Each was marked with faint scratches, aligned in patterns that echoed the tidal pools, the forest carvings, and the abandoned schoolhouse sketches. He paused at the edge of a meadow, noting the way fog curled around the tree line. In the distance, the sound of water from a hidden stream blended with the occasional bird call. At the meadow's center, stones had been arranged in a circular pattern, with moss growing between them. It was subtle, almost invisible from the road, yet intentional, a quiet marker in a place the casual passerby might never notice. A small bakery opened as he returned toward the village, the scent of bread drifting softly into the morning air. Inside, the baker mentioned a man who occasionally left small parcels for her to keep, never asking for payment. The parcels contained folded papers, sketches, or carefully carved objects, each seeming to mirror the patterns in the forest, the cliffs, and along the lake. She had set them aside, unsure of their meaning, yet felt a quiet reverence for the careful attention they implied. By late afternoon, he explored another trail through a dense grove of birch trees, their white bark glowing faintly in the soft light. Along the path, he found a series of small, almost hidden carvings on stones and tree trunks. They were different from the others, more intricate, more delicate, yet part of the same language, the same quiet rhythm. Some of the carvings were paired with small bundles of leaves or twigs, suggesting a marking of time or place. A ranger station further along the ridge offered maps showing footpaths he had not yet walked. He traced each trail slowly, noting the subtle changes in terrain and the quiet signs of human presence. Small piles of stones, the occasional discarded tool, remnants of cloth or rope. Nothing screamed for attention, yet each item added to the slow, deliberate story unfolding across the land. As twilight approached, he reached an abandoned fishing cabin perched over a narrow inlet. The wood groaned gently with the motion of the water below. Inside, jars of salt and dried herbs lined the shelves, along with a small ledger containing notes about tides, weather, and the subtle patterns of local wildlife. A small sketch tucked between the pages showed the coastline in minute detail, with symbols he recognized from previous discoveries. He walked the road back toward the cliffs as dusk settled, the horizon melting into mist. The tidal pools glimmered faintly under the soft moonlight, and the forest whispered gently in the evening air. Each location, each subtle clue, seemed to extend the rhythm of the mystery, drawing him forward without urgency, without noise, simply through the quiet insistence of pattern and observation. Near the edge of a hidden cove, he found another set of carvings on smooth stones, almost covered by sand and water. A few shells had been placed atop them in careful alignment. The constable knelt to examine them, feeling the slow pulse of intention behind each arrangement. He sensed the story was still unfolding, layer upon layer, quiet, deliberate, and patient, waiting for careful eyes to follow its gentle, persistent rhythm. A small pier stretched into the water, weathered and nearly forgotten. A lantern hung from the end, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. Beneath it, a small crate contained several carefully wrapped items, pieces of driftwood, carved figures, and bundles of dried seaweed. Each had faint markings, a soft echo of the carvings, sketches, and patterns he had encountered across the cliffs, forest, lake, and abandoned structures. The constable lingered as night deepened, listening to the soft lapping of water, the whisper of wind through trees, and the gentle groan of timber beneath his feet. Every discovery, every subtle observation, seemed to hum with quiet significance, an invitation to move slowly, to notice, and to continue following the intricate, patient pattern that stretched across the village, the cliffs, and the hidden corners of the surrounding wilderness. The following morning, mist hung low over the village, softening rooftops and fences into pale silhouettes. The constable followed a narrow lane that led away from the water's edge, the stones underfoot slick with dew. A solitary bakery sent thin tendrils of smoke curling from its chimney, carrying a faint scent of yeast and warmth into the damp air. Along a quiet road, he noticed a small workshop tucked between two larger, shuttered buildings. Its windows were dusty, yet inside, he glimpsed the glint of metal tools neatly arranged on a pegboard. A bell tinkled softly as he nudged the door, and an elderly craftsman emerged, nodding in silence. He gestured toward a corner where several small wooden carvings rested, their shapes echoing the patterns he had been tracing along the coast and forest trails. Continuing into the hills, a forgotten ranger cabin appeared behind a curtain of fir trees. The roof sagged under years of snow, but smoke rose faintly from a narrow chimney. Inside, a logbook lay open on a table, pages filled with observations of animal tracks, shifting riverbeds, and small human traces. An abandoned mitten here, a folded note there. Each entry was quiet, methodical, almost as if documenting the rhythm of the wilderness itself. A gravel path led him deeper into a dense copse of pines, where the sun barely reached the forest floor. Moss carpeted the ground in thick, soft layers, and fallen branches formed delicate, accidental patterns. Near a narrow stream, he noticed a line of stones placed deliberately along the bank, each one balanced carefully atop the other. The arrangement felt intentional, a silent signal for anyone walking slowly enough to notice. A half-hidden road wound down to a small lake, the water calm and mirrored under a pale sky. A rowboat, tied loosely to a weathered dock, rocked gently in place. Along the shoreline, faint footprints led to a grove of birch trees, where a series of small carvings decorated the bark. Unlike the previous symbols he had seen, these were elongated, flowing lines, as if meant to guide someone along the path without drawing attention to themselves. The constable found a remote cabin beyond the grove, nestled against the slope of a hill. Its windows were dark, yet the door stood ajar. Inside, a table held a neat pile of letters, tied together with frayed string. Each letter was written in precise, careful script, describing weather, tides, and subtle movements across the village and surrounding forests. He noticed small sketches in the margins, lines connecting hills, rivers, and roads in a pattern that seemed to trace the land itself. Further along a winding trail, he discovered a forgotten stone bridge arching over a narrow stream. The stones were slick with moss, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and pine. Underneath, small objects had been placed. A tiny carved figure, a a smooth pebble, a piece of cloth. Each seemed to have been arranged with care, as if marking the location or noting a moment of significance. A deserted general store appeared at the edge of a sunlit clearing. The windows were fogged with age, and the door hung on creaking hinges. Inside, he found shelves lined with objects left behind by previous owners. Jars, bundles of cloth, and a notebook filled with observations of the village and surrounding woods. The handwriting, small and steady, included patterns similar to those he had traced elsewhere, a quiet, consistent attention to detail that threaded through each discovery. As afternoon settled, he followed a narrow dirt road up to an abandoned fire tower perched on a hillside. The steps groaned gently beneath his feet, and the air smelled faintly of old timber and rain-soaked earth. From the top, he could see the village tucked between hills, the lake reflecting pale light, and the narrow trails winding through dense forest. Small carvings and markers appeared along the edges of the tower's foundation, again following a pattern he had come to recognize. On the far side of the ridge, a small boathouse rested at the edge of a hidden cove. Its boards creaked softly in the breeze, and the water lapped gently at its supports. Inside, he found crates of driftwood, wrapped bundles of reeds, and a notebook filled with sketches of the shoreline, tides, and subtle markings. Each sketch included delicate symbols and arrangements echoing those he had seen in the tidal pools, forests, and abandoned cabins. A narrow trail led him to a small orchard on the outskirts of the village. The trees bore fruit faintly glimmering with morning dew. Beneath one of the trees, stones were arranged in a careful semicircle, and nearby, a bundle of herbs had been tied together with twine. The arrangement was quiet, subtle, almost like a gentle invitation to notice what might otherwise go unseen. Later, he explored a gravel path leading toward a series of abandoned warehouses near the harbor. Their corrugated roofs groaned with age, and weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt. Inside one, sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, illuminating small piles of carefully arranged objects, bottles, pebbles, and small carved shapes. A journal left on a crate contained meticulous observations, noting wind patterns, water levels, and the faint tracks of visitors along the docks. A secluded dirt road led to a cabin on a hillside overlooking a narrow river. Smoke rose faintly from a thin chimney. Inside, a desk held papers describing subtle shifts in the landscape, tree growth, erosion, tidal changes. Small bundles of dried plants were carefully labeled and arranged, echoing the slow, deliberate care found at the lake, the cliffs, and the forest carvings. As twilight approached, he reached a narrow pier stretching into a quiet bay. The boards were wet from a passing drizzle, and the water reflected a muted sky. A small lantern at the end of the pier swung gently, its light illuminating objects left on the wood, carved figures, driftwood, and faintly etched patterns. Each arrangement resonated with the rhythm he had been following across forests, cliffs, lakes, and cabins, forming a slow, patient story across the landscape. A small, abandoned ranger cabin rested near the edge of a meadow beyond the pier. Its windows were dark, the paint faded, yet inside, a collection of maps and notes lay neatly on a shelf. The constable found delicate sketches of trails, streams, and trees, annotated with tiny symbols that mirrored every other location he had visited. Each mark, each object, seemed to echo the same quiet, deliberate rhythm, weaving together the landscape in subtle, patient patterns. The forest beyond the meadow grew dense, the trees tall and still in the evening air. Along a hidden path, small bundles of sticks and stones marked intervals, and tiny carvings adorned fallen logs. The constable paused, noticing the care with which each marker had been placed. They led slowly, deliberately, deeper into the quiet woods, inviting careful observation and unhurried attention. A forgotten dirt road curved past an old mill, its wheels silent, water drained from the channel. Inside, he found tools neatly stacked on shelves, a ledger detailing water levels and wheel rotations, and small sketches of the surrounding hills. A tiny bundle of dried flowers rested atop the ledger, tied with twine, placed with deliberate precision. Each object, each observation, continued the slow, steady pulse of quiet mystery he had been tracing across the region. He continued along a narrow trail to a secluded lakeside cabin, half hidden by reeds and low-hanging branches. Smoke rose faintly from a chimney, and the dock stretched into still water. Inside, small carved figures and bundles of carefully labeled herbs were arranged on shelves, accompanied by journals filled with observations of tides, weather, and the subtle movements of wildlife. Each detail echoed the previous discoveries, forming a quiet lattice of intention across the landscape. The constable paused near the edge of the lake as night fell, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the dock and the soft rustle of reeds in the breeze. The lanterns in the cabin flickered faintly, reflecting across the water. Each small object, carving, and mark he had encountered seemed to hum softly in the evening air, a patient, deliberate rhythm that extended through forest, lake, cliffs, cabins, and abandoned buildings alike. Along a narrow ridge leading back toward the village, he noticed tiny markings etched into stones and tree trunks, almost invisible unless one moved carefully and slowly. Nearby, small bundles of leaves and twigs suggested deliberate placement, gentle markers for an attentive observer. Each step along the ridge echoed the quiet, methodical attention that threaded through every discovery he had made across the region. The constable lingered on the ridge as moonlight spilled across the forest canopy. Shadows moved softly in the night air, and the faint hum of water and wind blended into a gentle cadence. Each sight, each quiet clue, seemed to pulse with the same patient energy, inviting him to notice, to follow, and to continue tracing the subtle, deliberate patterns that wove the land, the village, and the hidden corners of the wilderness into a slow, enduring story. A faint mist rolled in from the sea as the constable descended the ridge, the soft hiss of water against rocks echoing below. A narrow footpath led him through a stand of alder and willow, their branches brushing gently against his coat. The air carried a faint brine, mixed with the earthy scent of wet leaves, settling into a rhythm as he walked. At the base of the slope, he discovered an old boathouse partially hidden behind reeds and low brush. Its boards were warped and gray with age, yet inside, a single lantern rested on a table, unlit, beside a small collection of glass jars. Each jar contained something carefully arranged: pebbles, sand, and tiny carved pieces of driftwood. The arrangement was quiet, deliberate, as if waiting for someone patient enough to notice. Following a winding dirt road along the edge of the marshland, he passed a cluster of abandoned shacks, their roofs sagging and walls coated with peeling paint. One shack held remnants of a ledger, pages marked with faint symbols and times noted meticulously over weeks and months. A single pair of old boots stood beside the door, angled neatly as though the owner had paused mid-step and never returned. He continued along a path that led to a secluded hilltop, where a solitary windmill creaked in the gentle breeze. Its sails moved slowly, rhythmically, and the surrounding field was dotted with small stone cairns, arranged with careful spacing. Each cairn seemed to mark an unseen line or direction, leading the constable's gaze toward the edge of a distant forest. A narrow trail descended from the hill into dense woodland. Here, sunlight barely filtered through, leaving the ground soft and shadowed. Fallen branches were stacked in small, deliberate piles, and occasional carvings appeared on the bark of ancient oaks. Some were simple lines, others faint symbols, subtle enough to blend with the natural grain of the trees. He followed the trail to a forgotten ranger station, half hidden behind a curtain of ivy. The windows were opaque with dust, but inside, shelves held notebooks detailing wildlife observations, weather changes, and the occasional unexplained anomaly, a movement at dusk, a fleeting light in the distance. Each entry was quiet and unhurried, written with the care of someone attentive to subtle shifts in the environment. Beyond the ranger station, a narrow path wound down to a mirror-like lake nestled between two hills. A small wooden dock extended into the water, its boards darkened with age. A single rowboat lay moored, and on its seat rested a bundle of reeds tied neatly with twine. Along the shoreline, tiny carvings marked stones, their placement seeming intentional, like punctuation in an otherwise silent landscape. He ventured toward a cluster of remote cabins along the lake's far edge. The structures were small, some with moss-covered roofs, others nearly hidden behind overgrown hedges. One cabin had its door slightly ajar, revealing a shelf lined with journals and notebooks. Each contained sketches of the terrain, notes on weather, tidal patterns, and the quiet movements of the forest. Symbols and subtle marks repeated across pages, echoing those he had seen in distant cliffs, tidal pools, and forest trails. A narrow, winding road led him past an abandoned mill by a gently burbling creek. The wheel was still, and moss crept up the supports, yet inside the building, a ledger rested atop a crate, pages carefully filled with numbers, sketches, and delicate annotations. A small bundle of dried flowers lay beside it, tied with twine, left as if marking a moment in time. Near the edge of the forest, he discovered a hidden glade. Soft moss carpeted the floor, and scattered among it were small stone arrangements, each balanced with careful attention. In one corner, a hollow tree contained a few carved figures, aligned precisely along the curve of the bark. The constable knelt, noting how each figure seemed positioned to interact with light or shadow, or perhaps to be noticed only by someone moving slowly, patiently. A quiet road led him to the edge of a small village shop, open with the faint smell of baked bread and candles. The shopkeeper spoke softly of parcels left for her by a visitor who never entered fully, only placing small objects and notes on the counter before leaving. Each parcel contained items that mirrored the patterns he had been following: carvings, symbols, and subtle arrangements meant to be observed carefully. He continued along a trail that led into a dense pine forest, the ground soft with needles. A stream wound through the trees, its surface glinting faintly. Beside it, a small stone circle had been arranged on the mossy bank, with a bundle of sticks tied together in the center. A faint set of footprints suggested someone had recently paused here, leaving the circle and bundle as markers in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Beyond the forest, he came upon a secluded cabin overlooking a narrow river bend. Smoke rose faintly from a chimney, and the dock stretched out into the water, weathered but sturdy. Inside, a table held small, wrapped bundles of herbs and carved figures, accompanied by journals meticulously noting tidal shifts, wildlife observations, and subtle symbols etched alongside the text. Each detail echoed previous discoveries, forming a patient pattern across the landscape. As twilight fell, he followed a quiet dirt road up toward a rocky overlook, where the village and surrounding woods lay muted in the fading light. A small stone bench overlooked the scene, and on it rested a bundle of papers tied with twine. The papers contained sketches, symbols, and faint annotations connecting cliffs, forest paths, lakes, and cabins. Each mark invited careful observation, rewarding patience and attention to the slow, deliberate flow of the land. He lingered on the ridge as night deepened, the moon casting pale light over trees and water. The wind whispered softly through pines, and the faint pulse of distant waves added a subtle rhythm. Each carving, each object, each small bundle he had discovered seemed to breathe quietly, forming a network of gentle intention across forests, lakes, cliffs, cabins, docks, and abandoned structures. A narrow trail led him down to a hidden cove, where the water lapped softly against smooth stones. A small, weathered pier stretched into the bay, its boards faintly glowing in the moonlight. At the end of the pier, bundles of reeds, carved figures, and small pebbles had been placed in quiet patterns. Each arrangement seemed to whisper the same patient rhythm he had traced across the region, waiting for someone willing to move slowly and notice. He paused near the water's edge, the air thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. The soft murmur of wind and waves mingled with the gentle rustle of reeds, creating a calm cadence. Every subtle mark, carved line, and carefully placed object formed a slow, unhurried story, inviting the constable to continue following the delicate threads that wove through the village, the forest, the cliffs, and the quiet corners of the surrounding wilderness. A small gravel road led him past a series of abandoned cabins, half hidden by tall grass and brush. The roofs sagged, and windows were clouded with age, yet inside, objects had been left deliberately. Small carved pieces of wood, bundles of dried flowers, and journals filled with precise sketches. The markings repeated, patterns echoing across structures, water, and forest, a patient design unfolding in subtle, deliberate increments. Through the night, he wandered along a winding forest path that led to a hidden meadow. Moonlight glinted off dew on the grass, illuminating small arrangements of stones and twigs. A hollow tree contained tiny carved figures, each aligned with care. The constable traced the pattern slowly, feeling the same quiet rhythm that had threaded through tidal pools, docks, cabins, lakes, and abandoned structures. At the far edge of the meadow, a narrow creek reflected the pale sky. Small bridges of stone and wood spanned the water, each marked with subtle carvings and bundles of sticks. The constable paused, noting the careful alignment of each element, the deliberate placement that invited quiet attention. Every sight he encountered formed another piece of a patient, unfolding story, its rhythm slow and steady across the land. A solitary cabin perched on a hillside nearby, smoke rising faintly from its chimney. Inside, shelves held bundles of herbs, carved figures, and journals detailing subtle observations of tides, weather, and movement through forest and village. Each mark, sketch, and object echoed the quiet, deliberate pattern he had been tracing, a rhythm that connected cliffs, lakes, roads, and hidden trails in a slow, methodical pulse. The The constable continued along a forested ridge as dawn began to touch the sky. Shadows softened in the early light, and the faint scent of pine mingled with wet earth. Small carvings on stones and tree trunks, bundles of sticks and leaves, and carefully arranged objects continued to mark the trail. Each discovery seemed to beckon him onward, deeper into the quiet, unhurried story woven across the village, the cliffs, the forest, and the hidden reaches of the wilderness. He followed a narrow trail that sloped gently toward a small, hidden valley. Mist clung to the ground, curling around clusters of ferns and low shrubs. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and wildflowers, carrying the soft hum of distant insects and the occasional bird call. At the valley's center, a small, weathered barn stood alone, its red paint faded to muted rust. The door hung slightly crooked, and a narrow window let in a thin shaft of light. Inside, a collection of glass bottles and old tools rested on shelves, arranged carefully as though each had its place. A folded piece of paper tucked behind a bottle contained a sketch of the valley, small dots and lines marking positions along the ridge and nearby creek. A quiet road led him past a group of cottages along a tree-lined lane. Smoke drifted from chimneys, mixing with the faint scent of baking bread from a nearby bakery. An elderly woman waved from her porch, and he paused to speak. She mentioned a figure who sometimes moved silently through the village, leaving small objects or notes behind, never asking for attention. Her voice was low and even, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the rhythm of the day. Beyond the cottages, a gravel path wound up into a grove of towering maples. Here, sunlight barely reached the forest floor, softening the edges of moss-covered rocks and fallen logs. Along the trail, small bundles of sticks and stones marked intervals, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate observation rather than decoration. The constable traced his fingers along the carvings etched into the bark of trees, noting their quiet symmetry and repetition. A narrow dock stretched into a shallow lake further along the path. The water was still, reflecting the soft sky and surrounding trees. At the end of the dock, a small wooden crate contained several wrapped objects: feathers, smooth stones, and tiny carved figures. Each was aligned in careful, almost imperceptible patterns, and a note tucked beneath them bore faint sketches echoing the same symbols he had encountered in the forest, barns, and village. A winding trail led toward a small ranger cabin perched on a hillside above the lake. The door was ajar, and inside, shelves held neatly stacked journals and field notes. Each entry recorded subtle observations: animal tracks, shifting clouds, the movement of clouds over the hills. Tiny symbols and sketches in the margins connected the natural world to human presence, forming a rhythm that was quiet but persistent. He ventured along a narrow, overgrown path to a secluded glen where the stream curved gently among moss-covered boulders. Here, small cairns were stacked carefully along the water's edge, each balanced in a deliberate sequence. A hollow tree contained several carved figures, some shaped like animals, others more abstract. The constable knelt to examine them, noting how their positioning suggested movement through the glen, a silent guide for anyone following the subtle trail. A quiet road led him to a cluster of small, abandoned cabins near the edge of a clearing. The roofs sagged and shingles had fallen away, yet inside, remnants of human presence remained: journals, bundles of herbs, and small carved objects arranged neatly on shelves. Each item echoed symbols he had traced across the cliffs, docks, and forest paths, forming a slow, patient lattice connecting these scattered places. Later, he explored a narrow footpath that ran alongside a shallow creek. Fallen branches were stacked at intervals, and stones were placed with careful attention along the bank. A small wooden bridge spanned the water, and at its center lay a bundle of reeds tied together with twine. The constable traced the patterns with his eyes, recognizing the same rhythm that had guided him through barns, cabins, docks, and forest trails. He followed the trail up to a hill where a weathered stone tower overlooked the valley. The steps groaned beneath his weight, and the view from the top revealed winding trails, scattered cottages, and the glimmer of the lake in the distance. At the base of the tower, small carvings and carefully placed stones formed subtle patterns, each aligned with points in the surrounding landscape. A narrow road led to a quiet boathouse at the far end of the lake. Its boards creaked in the breeze, and a lantern hung unlit from a post. Inside, small bundles of herbs and carved objects rested on a table, accompanied by journals detailing tides, wildlife, and subtle markings. Each mark, sketch, and arrangement connected seamlessly with the rhythm of discoveries he had traced across the region. Beyond the lake, a forested trail led to a remote cabin perched on a ridge overlooking the water. Smoke curled faintly from a chimney, and the dock extended into the bay. Inside, journals, bundles of dried plants, and carved figures were arranged meticulously. Symbols repeated in the margins, echoing previous discoveries, creating a slow, deliberate pattern across hills, lakes, forests, and abandoned structures. A hidden dirt path led him to a meadow dotted with wildflowers, soft underfoot and glowing faintly in the evening light. Stones had been arranged in small, precise formations, and a hollowed log held tiny carved figures. The constable paused, noting the subtle interplay of placement and pattern, the same quiet, patient rhythm he had been tracing through the valley, along the lake, and across the village. The trail curved past a series of abandoned sheds, their doors hanging loose, roofs sagging. Inside one, remnants of notebooks and journals rested on shelves, filled with careful sketches of terrain, weather, and movement through the surrounding forests. Small objects, bundles of twigs, carved stones, tiny feathers, were arranged beside the notebooks, each echoing the quiet patterns of the region. He continued along a gravel road to a secluded pier, the boards slick with evening dew. A single rowboat was tied loosely, rocking gently with the faint swell of water. At the pier's end, bundles of reeds, carved figures, and small pebbles were arranged in careful patterns. The constable lingered, tracing the quiet rhythm across docks, forest paths, barns, and cabins, aware that each discovery built upon the last in a patient, deliberate sequence. A narrow trail led him toward a small, abandoned ranger station at the edge of a hillside. The door was cracked open, revealing shelves lined with journals and field notes. Observations of wildlife, subtle changes in terrain, and faint, almost imperceptible carvings in the margins continued the rhythm he had traced through lakes, cliffs, and forests. Each detail invited careful attention, rewarding patience with the soft pulse of a quiet story unfolding across the land. He paused near the edge of a small creek, where stones were stacked deliberately along the bank, and small bundles of twigs marked intervals. The soft murmur of water mingled with the rustle of reeds in the evening breeze. Each carved figure, each carefully arranged object, each faint symbol in a journal echoed a slow, unhurried pattern, inviting him to move gently, observe closely, and follow the patient rhythm across the cliffs, forests, lakes, and hidden corners of the wilderness. Through the night, he traced a narrow trail to a small, forgotten cabin tucked behind a grove of pines. Its windows were clouded with age, yet inside, small carved objects, bundles of dried herbs, and journals were arranged with meticulous care. Each page and each symbol resonated with discoveries made at docks, barns, trails, and hidden clearings, forming a quiet, deliberate lattice that stretched across the landscape in a soft, patient pulse. The constable lingered near a hillside overlooking the lake, where the moonlight glimmered across still water. Shadows moved gently among trees and reeds, and the soft hum of wind and water created a calming cadence. Every carving, bundle, and careful arrangement seemed to breathe slowly in the night, extending the quiet, unhurried story across the village, the cliffs, the forests, the docks, and every hidden, patient corner of the surrounding wilderness. Before dawn, he followed a narrow, winding path that led away from the lakeshore, the mist softening the shapes of trees and rocks. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and pine, and the distant call of a loon echoed across the water. Every step was careful, slow, deliberate, as though moving too quickly would disturb the quiet pulse of the landscape. Along the path, he came upon a small, abandoned greenhouse tucked behind a thicket of willow and alder. The glass panes were dusty and cracked, yet inside, shelves held empty pots, carefully stacked tools, and a few dried seed packets. A notebook lay open on a windowsill, pages filled with delicate sketches of plants, soil patterns, and faint symbols that seemed to mirror those he had encountered elsewhere. A gravel road led him past a cluster of shuttered cottages, where the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. A woman tending a small herb garden noticed him and spoke softly about a man who sometimes walked these roads, leaving small bundles along the way, twigs, stones, and tiny carvings, but never revealing his purpose. She spoke with a quiet reverence, as if acknowledging a rhythm too subtle for casual notice. The path curved into a dense pine forest, where the morning light filtered softly through tall trunks. Fallen branches were stacked with care, forming small markers along the trail. Near a narrow brook, smooth stones had been balanced in sequences, and a hollow log contained faint carvings, delicate and precise, suggesting movement or guidance for someone walking slowly. Further along the ridge, he discovered a small, weathered windmill overlooking a hidden meadow. Its sails turned gently in the breeze, creaking softly. At the base, a series of small stones and twigs were arranged in quiet sequences, aligned along the slope as though tracing a line invisible to the casual eye. The constable paused, noting how the pattern interacted with the morning light, shifting subtly as the sun rose higher. A narrow dirt road led him to a secluded boathouse at the edge of a quiet cove. The boards were slick with dew, and the faint scent of brine and wood filled the air. Inside, bundles of reeds, carved figures, and small stones were arranged carefully atop a table. A journal rested nearby, pages filled with sketches of water patterns, tides, and subtle annotations that mirrored the carvings he had seen along forest paths and hidden ridges. He followed a narrow trail through an orchard, where trees bore early fruit glistening with moisture. Beneath one tree, stones were arranged in a deliberate circle, with a bundle of dried herbs resting in the center. The constable knelt, tracing the edges of each stone, noticing how the arrangement reflected similar rhythms he had observed at docks, cabins, and forest clearings. Later, He explored a quiet road that curved past a row of abandoned shops. Their windows were clouded with dust, and the doors hung loosely on rusted hinges. Inside one shop, he found a shelf lined with small carved objects, bundles of twigs, and notebooks filled with meticulous sketches and faint symbols. Each mark echoed the subtle, patient patterns he had been following, connecting village streets, forest trails, and lakeside docks. A narrow trail led to a remote ranger cabin on a hillside, smoke curling gently from the chimney. Inside, field journals lay open beside small bundles of dried plants and carved figures. Notes described subtle changes in wildlife, water flow, and terrain, with symbols repeated in margins that mirrored previous discoveries. Each item seemed deliberately placed, part of a quiet, continuous rhythm across the land. He wandered along a winding path into a hidden glen where moss-covered stones and fallen logs created natural sculptures. Small arrangements of sticks and stones appeared along the stream's edge, leading his gaze to a hollow tree that contained tiny carved figures. Each placement suggested movement and attention, a deliberate pattern meant to be traced slowly and carefully. Beyond the glen, a small gravel road led to a secluded hillside cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a dock extended into a narrow inlet. Inside, carved figures, bundles of herbs, and journals were arranged with precise care. Sketches of the surrounding landscape, with faint symbols and notations, echoed patterns he had observed in barns, boathouses, forest trails, and lakeside clearings. A narrow, overgrown footpath led him toward a forgotten mill by a shallow creek. Moss coated the stones, and the wheel was still. Inside, a ledger rested on a crate, alongside small bundles of twigs, carved stones, and faintly etched notes. Each arrangement repeated subtle rhythms, marking time and movement across the landscape, linking forests, lakes, docks, and cabins with quiet persistence. He followed a winding trail to a hidden meadow where dew-laden grass glimmered in the early morning light. Stones had been placed carefully, forming delicate, intentional patterns. A hollowed log held tiny carved figures aligned along its curve. The constable traced each pattern slowly, feeling the same quiet rhythm threading through barns, docks, cabins, trails, and hidden clearings. At the far edge of the meadow, a narrow creek wound through soft earth. Small wooden bridges crossed at intervals, each marked with subtle carvings. Bundles of twigs rested beside stones, arranged deliberately. The constable paused, noting the patient, unhurried pulse of intention that connected these locations across forests, hills, lakes, and village streets. He climbed a gentle slope to a secluded cabin overlooking a river bend. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, and a dock extended into the water. Inside, journals and small carved figures were arranged with care, alongside bundles of herbs and sketches of tides, trees, and wildlife. Each mark, each object, repeated the quiet patterns he had been tracing, forming a patient, deliberate story across the landscape. A narrow trail led him through a dense grove to a hidden ridge. Moonlight filtered through the leaves, illuminating small cairns, stones, and bundles of sticks placed at intervals. Carvings appeared on tree trunks, delicate and precise, suggesting careful observation and subtle guidance. The constable moved slowly, tracing the rhythm connecting cliffs, lakes, cabins, docks, and forest paths. Through the night, he wandered along a narrow dirt road toward a forgotten pier. The boards creaked softly underfoot, and the water lapped gently beneath. At the pier's end, bundles of reeds, carved stones, and small figures rested carefully. Each arrangement seemed to echo all previous discoveries, forming a patient, deliberate network that threaded through the village, forests, lakes, cliffs, and hidden corners of the wilderness. A gravel path led him to a small, abandoned barn on a hillside. Its roof sagged under years of weather, yet inside, shelves held journals, bundles of herbs, and carved figures arranged in deliberate patterns. Notes detailed subtle changes in the landscape, wildlife, and human activity, repeating symbols that connected with every other location he had explored. He paused near a quiet creek, where stones were stacked in careful sequences along the bank. Bundles of sticks rested nearby, small carved figures placed with intent. The soft murmur of water and rustling reeds created a slow, calming rhythm. Each object, mark, and arrangement whispered the same quiet story, inviting patient observation across forests, lakes, cabins, docks, and hidden pathways. The constable followed a winding trail to a small cabin tucked behind a grove of birch trees. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, and inside, journals, carved figures, and bundles of herbs were arranged meticulously. Sketches included symbols and subtle notations that echoed prior discoveries, reinforcing the slow, deliberate rhythm connecting every location across the land. A narrow path led him along a ridge overlooking the lake. Moonlight shimmered on the water, illuminating the subtle outlines of forested slopes. Small carvings on stones and tree trunks, careful bundles of twigs and leaves, and arranged figures continued to mark the trail. Each step revealed another layer of the patient, quiet story unfolding across the village, cliffs, docks, forests, and hidden corners of the wilderness. He paused on the ridge, looking down at the lake below, now silvered by early morning light. The soft ripple of water against the shore seemed to echo the rhythm he had been tracing, a gentle, persistent pulse that tied the land together. For the first time, he noticed how the carvings, stones, and bundles formed lines, subtle markers guiding movement through the forests, across ridges, and along the water's edge. Walking slowly, he retraced steps along the narrow trail, noticing patterns he had overlooked in earlier visits. The sequence of cairns along the creek, the careful arrangements at the meadow, and the sketches tucked into journals all began to align in his mind. They weren't random. They were a map, not of geography alone, but of presence, of someone who had moved thoughtfully across the landscape over years. At the abandoned barn, he paused by a journal he had seen before. Reading the entries slowly, he recognized a rhythm to the observations. Tides and wind, forest growth and animal tracks, subtle changes in weather, all connected to the places where small carved figures and stone arrangements had been left. It was as though someone had recorded the passing of time in the world itself, leaving gentle markers for an observer who cared enough to follow. He walked down to the lake, the water still and calm in the morning light. The bundles on the pier, the carvings along the shoreline, and the careful placement of driftwood all reflected the same patient attention. He realized these were not messages in the conventional sense, but invitations to watch, to notice, to move quietly through the world with care and observation. At the remote ranger cabin, he spread out journals and sketches from several locations, arranging them side by side. Symbols repeated across sketches, carvings, and stone markers, forming a delicate lattice connecting cliffs, forests, meadows, and the lake. Slowly, it became clear this was a record of movement, a mapping of the natural world intertwined with human presence, subtle yet deliberate. He returned to the forest trail, following small cairns and bundles that now felt more like signposts than puzzles. Each placement made sense in context. The markers at the creek led to the hollow log. The stones in the meadow aligned with the cabin on the hillside. The carvings along the ridges formed a rhythm connecting each quiet space. There was intention here, a careful choreography of observation and care, a narrative without words, conveyed in shape and placement. A breeze stirred the trees, brushing gently against his shoulders as he walked toward the old windmill. The stone arrangements at its base now seemed to echo the patterns he had seen at the meadow and the boathouse. He understood that the markers were chronological as much as spatial, a slow documentation of presence, noting changes in tides, growth in the forest, and the passage of days and seasons. At the hidden glen, he knelt beside the small carved figures in the hollow tree. Each figure aligned not only with the water and stones, but with the broader pattern he had begun to see. The creator of these marks had moved deliberately, tracing a quiet narrative across the land. The mystery was not one of danger or crime. It was one of attention, of mapping life in a place where most would move too quickly to notice. He wandered along the ridge toward the village, piecing together observations from cottages, boathouses, and barns. Each discovery now seemed less isolated, more part of a patient, reflective design. The parcels left with the baker, the journals at the ranger station, the carvings in the forest, they all spoke of someone who had spent years attuning themselves to the rhythms of the land, recording movement, growth, and subtle shifts. At the small pier, he lingered over the arrangements of reeds, stones, and carved figures. With the perspective of all he had seen, he realized the placements mirrored natural patterns, tidal flows, the curve of the shoreline, the slope of the hills. The symbols in journals were sketches of observation, not codes or secrets, but a way to mark the passage of time, to trace connection and care in a quiet, deliberate fashion. He returned to the hillside cabin overlooking the river bend, setting out journals and sketches side by side. The patterns across all locations coalesced into a subtle map of movement, observation, and intention. Slowly, he understood. The mystery was not of hidden malice or misfortune, but of someone chronicling the life of a place with patience and reverence, leaving traces for others willing to move with similar care. Walking through the early morning forest once more, he noticed the rhythm of wind and water, light and shadow, matching the patterns he had followed. The carved stones, bundles of sticks, and carefully placed figures were not warnings or puzzles. They were invitations, reminders to slow down, to see the quiet interplay of life and landscape. Each element fit naturally into the larger design he had traced across the village, the cliffs, the meadows, and the lakes. By the time he reached the glade where small cairns and carved figures marked intervals along the brook, the realization settled fully. The creator of the markers had intended for a careful observer to notice the world with patient attention, to follow rhythm and placement rather than story or words. The constable walked slowly through the glade, feeling the subtle pulse of time and care, the quiet narrative of connection between human and land unfolding naturally before him. He lingered on the ridge above the lake as sunlight filtered softly through morning mist. Each stone, carving, and bundle he had discovered now felt less like individual clues and more like notes in a gentle symphony. The mystery resolved itself quietly, not through revelation or confrontation, but through understanding, a slow comprehension of intention, rhythm, and the patient observation of a world otherwise easy to overlook. Returning to the village, he paused at the small bakery, speaking quietly with the woman who had mentioned the parcels. She smiled faintly, nodding as he described the patterns he had traced, the connections he had noticed. She had always felt the care in the parcels, the quiet attention behind them. Now it made sense. Someone had moved through the village and surrounding lands for years, chronicling life with delicate attention, leaving traces to be noticed by those who would move slowly enough to see. He walked along the edge of the cliffs, the wind soft, the waves below glinting silver in the morning light. Every carved stone, bundle of sticks, and journal placed in cabins, forests, and along docks now fit into a single, quiet understanding. The story was not of alarm or danger, but of presence, observation, and patience. The constable breathed slowly, feeling the calm coherence of the pattern, the subtle pulse of someone who had watched and marked the world with deliberate care, leaving a quiet, enduring rhythm across land and water. Along the forest path back toward the hillside cabin, he paused at a cluster of small cairns and carved figures. For the first time, he noticed the alignment with the rising sun, the gentle shadowing that mirrored tidal shifts, tree growth, and the curve of distant ridges. The realization settled gently. The mystery was complete not with action, but with perception. By observing, noticing, and following the deliberate rhythm of intention, the constable had come to understand the quiet, patient story that had been unfolding all along.